Oh my god.
You printed it out analog style, like
Yeah, because
cool,
like
cool.
just after a while, like just you get eye strain, just like looking at a screen. I hate reading stuff online. I just like to, I got that couch here, so whenever it's time to like read something, I just lie down. Um,
Mm. I guess for me, it's completely naturalized at this point. Just the experience of everything on the phone, even movies to some degree, cinemas now.
mhm,
I hear filmmakers complaining about the miniaturization of cinema, on these
mhm.
handheld devices. But it's now almost just completely. I almost don't think in widescreen cinema anymore. I mean, what do you think about this? The way that sort of technology is changing our perception of media this way. That's a
W-
kind of a big opener, isn't it? But
yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of comments about this. But I guess the first one is, so you said that you're used to this kind of new media, you're used to reading on Kindle. And obviously, a lot of my reading has to be done electronically now. If Dan sends something or whatever, I'm not going to print it all out, although I used to do that like 10 years ago.
mhm.
Um, do you find it though that it's harder for you to remember stuff? Because I recently read Breakfast of Champions on Kindle, and then I bought a hard copy to take notes. And I mean, I just remembered much more in the second reading, and it wasn't just because it was a second reading, right? It was also because it's a print book, right? It's just you could naturally flip through pages. The act of taking down notes in the margins, right, that gives it a lot more visceral access to the text. I do find that I remember better when I'm just reading print, right, and there's that
Mhm.
kind of tactile kind of element to it.
Yeah, I perfectly understand this. I mean, I have an obsession with paperbacks,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole culture of paperback novels that kind of came up sort of mid-century, especially in Britain, where suddenly you just have a whole bunch of really affordable English literary classics, just 75 pence for a copy of, you know, um, Chekhov or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And it's small enough to carry around in your pocket. And also the literary fetishism that goes on with having a handheld, you can, the tactility, you can make
Mm-hmm.
notes in the margin. You take books out from the library and people leave sort of things in the notes and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's something that's what do you think that represents in a way? Because in I had some like in my notes that were prepared for our conversation, and I was telling you before our conversation in our email correspondence that like there are lots of ideas. I've got lots of ideas about what I want to talk about with you in regards to kind of art and also politics, because that makes up
Mm-hmm.
a decent portion of kind of the work you put out on automachination
Yeah.
and kind of this whole idea of art and politics and what have you. And it seems to come back again to this question of society's freedoms versus art's freedoms, and this whole question of kind of the larger social context of kind of art, because art is something that appears within culture. So how does it relate to social problems and ideas of
Mm-hmm.
like social decline, for instance, and cultural stagnation, and technological stagnation even. It's tricky because we were talking about the 90s in our email correspondence, and it seems that that's a really big transitional moment from the analog to the digital to like
Mm-hmm.
this new internet age we're living in now, which we had internet sort of stage one, which was kind of very utopian, very kind of Silicon Valley, but now it's much more social media, highly mediated, lots of market research and algorithms. One can't help but see that as a larger context for our culture as well, and sort of what you talk about on automachination with sort of ideas about sort of cultural decline, or ideas about say sort of dumbing down of culture, for instance, sort of a homogeneity in
Mm-hmm.
culture, which I think is a very sort of it's symptomatic of kind of neoliberal culture and sort of what you might call techno-capitalist sort of culture. But this whole question of kind of art's freedom as opposed to society's freedom, I think it's there in sort of the way we talk about art and the way we talk about content and form and what have you. Kind of like what's art's responsibility to society, and in what way does art's freedom, you might say, have to do with social freedom? I mean, so so like, obviously, I don't think of you as a guy who would say art is politics or kind of like, I mean, I think if I were to go by what I see in your videos, I'd say you were much more of an art for art's sake kind of person. But what does that mean now? Because I don't think it's the kind of art for art's sake we get in the the writings of Trotsky or even Walter Benjamin or even someone like Ruskin, the modern painters writer. So what does art for art's sake mean now? What does art's freedom mean now, kind of in this sort of in the year 2021, you know?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a few things there. We said we were going to talk about like the 90s, I guess, in general. Maybe that would be like a little bit later, but just kind of
this is just kind of a proceed of the ideas that I had going into this conversation. Stuff I wanted to talk about you with regards to, like, you know.
Well, I mean, so first of all, growing up, just to touch on the 90s briefly, like I feel very lucky in the fact that, well, I'm a bit older than you, but when I was growing up, I was kind of like, right in the middle of the transition period from, analog to digital, as it were. And I mean, during that time, I kind of had the best of both worlds in the sense that, when I look back to my childhood, like the mere fact that I had so much kind of physical freedom to kind of roam, different neighborhoods in Brooklyn. I was, out late even as a child, and there was never really a sense of like, fear for safety, right? There was no kind of, intense pressure to schedule everything and everyone. You see like kids like having play dates, and like, to me, that's so like unreal, right? I mean, that's not really a way to grow up, at least in my eyes. And when it comes to sort of, digital media coming out of the internet, sort of happening around the time I was, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, 13 years old. Like when it first started, it was a lot more anonymous in many ways, right? And just like television, when it first started, it by definition had to like bring in very few people, comparatively speaking, since very few people could afford televisions. Well, same thing with the internet, right? Many people didn't even have computers, right? Much less like a modem of some sort, much less being able to pay, like a $10 or $20, whatever it was, fee. Probably was actually a lot more. We're just kind of like thinking back to it a little better. But so that took a lot of people out of the equation already, but it was also very anonymous. Like my first interaction online was like making AOL screen names, right? And there's no like, there's no kind of a conception that it's going to be linked to your identity, right? You could go to like chat rooms when you're 12, 13, you can meet people, right? You could develop actual friendships that way. That's what I did many times. You can meet people in internet forums. Like when I was growing up, like a major thing that I did, like a lot of my politics came from just arguing with people online, the same shit that I do now. Just like, arguing with people online. But the difference between now versus like internet forums in the early 2000s is you had nobody, and this is one of the things that disturbs me, like you had nobody that could upvote or downvote a comment that you make in a forum somewhere. You only had the text. And whoever they were responding to, they had one of two choices. They could either come up with a better response than what you put forward, in which case, you start to lose that argument, or you win that argument and everybody's able to see it, right? There's no, it's true that you could have a pile on, like a bunch of people in a forum, like all trying to attack you. But generally speaking, you don't have this kind of sense of like dumbed down numerical supremacy. And the fact that like, you look at comments on, newspaper sites, you look at, YouTube or whatever, the fact that everything is geared towards, we're going to make the most viral type comments, most prominent. When we think of like what goes viral and the kinds of incentives that taps in, just like biologically speaking, those are all the wrong incentives. Like truth, people say, truth eventually wins out. Perhaps in some ways it does, in some places and in some, situations, I guess. But in general, what tends to win out is virality. Right.
I think the interesting thing though about the sort of, I mean, I was very young kind of in the late 90s, but it seems retrospectively that the internet was sort of a more optimistic place, or like there seemed to be a more how should one say, libertarian feeling in the air, that kind of, you know, this was unregulated, people could share all sorts of stuff online, that kind of, you know, it was but now it seems to be the opposite, where, you know, pretty much everything one does is involved in someone's market research project. And, you know, algorithms and what have you are creating these literal echo chambers where, you know, like you were alluding to, the tabloid content and this sort of tabloidization of kind of all these online spaces in terms of the most sort of hysterical, most intense sort of feedback, you know, kind of stories about, you know, we've seen the rise of these people you talk about in your videos sometime, like these alt-right people, kind of these political extremists, sort of Facebook sort of conspiracy theorists and what have you, kind of all these things that are kind of sort of, I think they're emblematic of the way that kind of the internet and social media have changed kind of culture in a big way. Like, do you think kind of like it's a case that there's a lot less possible now online, or that the internet brings out people's worst tendencies now?
You know, I'm not sure if, like, in an absolute sense, less is possible now, but definitely, you know, just like imagine, just, you know, philosophically speaking, you have some sort of causal chain. It's true that the closer and closer that you get to the present time, you have choked out any number of possibilities along the way, right? Just by the logic of any kind of causal chain. And the kind of decisions that have been made over the past 30 years, right, since the advent of the internet, have choked out, you know, maybe not completely certain possibilities, but I definitely don't like the way that things are going. And the most kind of crass instantiation of this, like I was reading some, you know, comment a couple months ago, some guy was like, you know, look at like 2011 Twitter versus today. You know, these days I can't even call a fat bitch fat anymore, which is true. I mean, you would get banned for, like, you know, making fun of someone on Twitter online. And, you know, I think it's a worthwhile kind of discussion to have in terms of, you know, should people be allowed to insult, you know, others in this kind of, you know, centralized platform? I mean, whatever. But the real issue is that all of this tends to, like, creep out into other categories of, you know, like, for example, when I put up political videos, when I, for example, put up that, you know, Palestine video, I was definitely very conscious of the fact that this could easily at some point get my channel flagged. Right. And you know, that's because, like, although, like, certain types of woke ideology is in, that's only because it's useful to the ruling class. Taking, you know, the positions that I take on Israel Palestine, that's not useful to anyone in the ruling class. So this is the thing that, you know, has to get flagged. I've always this didn't cross my mind 20 years ago, but now, since I'm on YouTube, I'm thinking, like, there's definitely a possibility that within 5 years or, like, whatever, that my channel gets taken down, right? Because I have, you know, I have a video, you know, where I read from Mark Twain and I don't censor the dirty words, right? You know, I read a James Baldwin essay, and I read the essay as he fucking wrote it, and that might get me flagged, right? Like, the fact that people have to think about this, right? And the fact that everything is so, like, if you have a website and Google, for whatever reason, for a good reason or a bad reason, if Google decides to punish you, you don't have a recourse, right? The only people that are going to find you are people that use Bing or maybe DuckDuckGo or some other search engine. If YouTube decides to take down your channel, you don't have any other easily accessible platforms that could allow your ideas to go viral. So you're playing essentially in what seems like an ever expanding sandbox, and I guess in some ways it is, but in other ways it's clearly constricting. And I'm very conscious of this fact, right? So there's definitely stuff going on now that it's only going to accelerate for the worse, right? Down the road.
There's the sense that, you know, like, you know, what you were saying there, it gets me in mind of just how prevalent culture wars content is on the internet, and, you know, this whole sort of different sides taking sort of this game of one-upmanship, political one-upmanship, and what have you, and how it becomes a kind of a tabloid media with people sort of doing these sensational, shocking stories. And you know, I suppose I like, because you make political content and you kind of address these sort of culture wars that go on in regards to, you know, you were saying to me in an email, kind of like the balkanization, I think, of like culture. Is that what you said? Like, I
was specifically referring to balkanization of arts, but I mean, we could talk about culture too. Yeah, it's both.
But this kind of soft police activity that goes on all the time and seems almost like now a symptom of like this highly mediated, you know, internet kind of online experience we have, and is now just a part of our everyday daily lives. That kind of soft police activity and management that goes on all the time is really kind of inescapable. It has more and more a grip on our lives. So that kind of, you know, in contrast to how we thought about the internet kind of at the beginning, where kind of, you know, you could set up these parlors, these zones, these like sort of your own kind of little synthetic kind of domain and what have you. And where it could become a haven for the autodidact or the hacker, what have you. Now
and it still is. This is the thing, like, depending on your temperament, who you are, what you're up to, there's a ton of shit that you could like learn, and you know, you could enrich yourself so much, you know, being online, if you avoid the very kind of human pitfalls that are being constantly set up more and more and more in your way. Like you talked about that culture war content. It's like, these people aren't even talking about politics. Like, they have absolutely no bone in these fights. Like, it's like not relevant to them at all, but because they have no meaning in their lives, right? This becomes kind of this, you know, simulation they're engaging in, right? Politics is a kind of simulation for them. And, you know, a lot of them are just having a good time. Like, you know, it's like from Killing of a Chinese Book. Right? I'm only happy when I'm, you know, angry, when I'm sad. And it's like, yeah, like, you know, I definitely, you know, I definitely, you know, it's weird to say, I said this before, but it's like, I enjoy when people, you know, talk shit to me online. I enjoy some of my anger. I mean, I grew up as an angry child, and instead of kind of allowing it to have negative consequences, you know, there's other ways to feed it that are more constructive. But, you know, for many people that have like no way to like stop themselves, and that's all they have in their lives, they're going to be like all day obsessed with these, you know, culture war bullshit, right? So, you know, and I think long term though, I think
it becomes like a feedback loop though.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If you mind my saying, like, for instance, there are all these kind of I've called them almost kind of agent provocateur, kind of public social media pranksters, you know, like that were quite common during Trump's election, who would sort of do all this vile publicity seeking. And then liberal pundits on the internet would make, you know, days and days and days of worth of content about these vile people. And people would watch those videos and they would go like, and it just becomes a self-perpetuating thing, a kind of a feedback loop of just vile horribleness, where the derogation and the condemnation and all the kind of the points that the liberal pundits are making are just they're stripped of any power, they're stripped of any force, because it's reflexive. It's their derogation becomes vice, where they criticize the person, but there's an old like comedy sketch on from a guy called Lemmy. It's like, you gave them exactly what they wanted. You gave them attention. Like, are you happy? You gave them what that's how it. So
and they need to give them attention because they need to feed off of the anger, because it's like, you know, they're like people that are motivated by like, oh, you know, I hate Trump and I hate Trump voters because, I don't know, I was walking down the fucking street with my black girlfriend and somebody shouted something from a car at her, right? And you know, that got me really angry. And it's like, you know, like I get in an interpersonal level why you would be angry at that person or like a category of people in general, but you know, just generally speaking, like, I mean, what Biden has done against Black people in America, it's just incomparable, right? And like instead of getting angry at things that matter like that, instead you're angry at, you know, some shit that you saw on YouTube. Everybody's angry at shit they see on YouTube. You know, it doesn't seem very sustainable. Well,
it's true, but it's also, but it's a number of things too as well. I mean, like what we were talking about, kind of that I very early in my kind of, when I started making YouTube videos, I made sort of videos about slam poetry, and because, you know, I kind of like had opinions about slam poetry. I didn't think it was very good, and I made these videos, And actually, of all the videos on my channel, they're the most popular, and it's why I get kind of most people coming to my channel. But not long after I made those videos, I started looking at other videos on YouTube of similar people sort of making these videos about why slam poetry is bad, this Instagram poet is bad, what, you know, why so-and-so sucks. And you see how it just becomes another content farm. It becomes another kind of cottage industry of people making these videos where, you know, on cue, they have their derogative opinion about this and that, and it becomes just another commodity, you know, something that kind of, you know, people want to watch because, you know, that's what they want. And that repulsed me. That kind of repelled me. And
I agree.
That's the danger I would always feel with making political content, which is why kind of like, I think that's the risk that I kind of am sort of unwilling to take, because I don't want to, like, I mean, my hands are much dirtier than this, like, I'll say that much. But political content is like something that, like, kind of, you know, you unavoidably end up talking to very kind of stupid people. And
of course,
very stupid, pathologically kind of violent people in a way. And it's the frustration of, especially being in Britain, kind of during this huge populist nationalist revival that we've had now, of kind of where everyone has this fantasy idea of what Britain is, kind of great colonial Britain. It's a fucking pack of lies, you know, but people put the myth first. Absolutely, the myth comes first every time. And that's what informs their blind racism and their xenophobia.
And I agree about, you know, how dirty it feels. Like, first of all, like, if you ever, like, you know, look up tutorials or whatever, like how to get, you know, a successful YouTube channel, how to get, you know, more subscribers, like whatever. Almost everything revolves around, you have to absolutely maintain a specific kind of niche, which, you know, I guess it makes sense, but it really overemphasizes a very kind of strict kind of content, right? Which, you know, if you're like an artist, or if you have like multifaceted interests, it's sort of hard to do that, right? Especially since you want to bring out other parts of yourself and to, you know, put it out there. But you know, I'm not sure exactly why you feel dirty about like political content, but the reason why it makes me feel dirty is I constantly think, like, shouldn't I be spending my time on things that only I can do, right? It's not that, you know, I have, you know, bad political content. You know, when I made that Zionism video, the birth of Israel, I was like, you know what, let me make the best video that's out there on the founding of Israel, the contradictions, and why, you know, we are where we are today. And I think I did that. I think it's one of the best things you could find on, and you could see in the comments, people are like, wow, like, you know, I study this all the time, and this presents so much stuff that I didn't know. At the same time, whenever I'm doing that, I know there's plenty of people out there that if they had the will to do so, they could probably do an even better job than I am in this kind of stuff. But the things that people cannot do has to do with, like, if I go for like 2 hours, like talking about, you know, a book of poetry or whatever, people can't do that. People can't break down a poem. People can't break down books. Like, they just don't know how. And, you know, the fact that my mind constantly, my mind is very, very prone to just wandering all the time. And I have to do so many things to keep myself in line. Like, I have to always keep a strict schedule. When I take my daily walks, I have to make sure that, no, you're not going to be listening to some fucking podcast. You're not going to be listening to some, like, you know, it's the equivalent of like TMZ shit, except with, like, you know, cultural, you know, warriors, right? It's just that's like the new celebrity culture garbage. I have to tell myself, like, you know what, like, you have to, like, sit, you have to walk, and you have to, like, listen to a book or something, right? You have to do something productive. And whenever I upload a political video, even though I keep doing it again and again and again, it's constantly like, should I do this? Should I delete this? Like, should I keep doing this? Like, I always feel regret when I upload something political, right?
Regret, really?
Yeah, well, you know, it's maybe regret is too strong of a word, but I do think, like, well, imagine if all you did, Alex, for the past year was just make arts videos. Like, when I think, like, okay, what do you want your channel to look like 3 years from now? What do you want your channel to be known for? Honestly, it's not like my political takes. Like, I don't really care all that much, right? Although a part of me cares, right? But the bigger part of me says, I want to just do arts related stuff. I want people to read my books. I want people, on my side for other reasons, besides politics, which is just so cheap and so dime a dozen in this world.
Yeah, that makes sense. But so you feel like but what's the overlap then between kind of the political stuff and the aesthetic stuff then? If you think that kind of aesthetics might be another way to get people on side or what have you. It's tricky now because I think, again, the tricky thing with culture war stuff is that art becomes a big thing for reactionaries and a big kind of bellwether for people. And like it's a thing that I've tried to point out in some of my videos now, where kind of the notion of a cultural decline or the notion of art's decline is used as part of kind of some moral panic, kind of like culture is trash, decadence, that sort of thing. And the rise of populism, the rise of fascism, and what have you. It seems to be a moment of, I would say, it's a period of resolution for the arts, I would think. Like what with the amount of political strife, the whole upheaval of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I would say also our monoculture now, kind of our culture of sort of like you could call like a normcore culture, where everybody. It's hard to kind of articulate, if only to say that nowadays, like a lot of kind of reactionaries talk about sort of postmodernism and sort of postmodernism's collapse of values and what have you, kind of sort of high and low, past and present. But I think it's much more kind of the problem of the naturalization of the arts and the fact that kind of like so much of our world right now is like just so mediated and so kind of manipulated by management and by what have you. It's very hard, I think, to sort of it's very hard to kind of it's very hard to what does the purity of art represent in this context? What are you trying to save the art from? And to what end? Is it the case that kind of art has to define its own purity, but then against what? And I think the problem I've had with a lot of people kind of on the internet is those who say kind of art needs to be put back into the service of kind of the human, or kind of the sort of species being sort of political insurrection and what have you. And I don't know, like I don't know really whether these things are believable or not anymore. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. Like it does seem the believability of a certain kind of art has dropped away, but yet it seems to continue off its own accord. And I think that's a tricky thing when like it's almost like zombie culture in a way. Do you know what I mean? Kind of like people very unthinkingly, unfeelingly do things because it's just assigned. It's just a role. It's just an academy. Kind of like, this is what I do. I'm in a perfunctory way fulfilling this role. Almost like the content creators we have now online, where they they look at themselves as quote unquote creators, and not writers, journalists, what have you.
I hate that term creator.
Creator,
it's so like especially like if it's added with the word content, it's so like gutless, it's so bloodless, and anybody by definition then is a content creator. And it's true whether or not you're creating like great art on YouTube, or if you're just putting out some makeup tutorials or like whatever, right? But I mean, like when I was growing up, like I guess the where like my politics and the arts intersect is I only got into politics really by way of the arts. Like, so this is I guess how it happened. We said we are going to talk about rap. I guess we could sort of maybe like
Sure.
touch on that now. Like when I was growing up, I was listening to a lot of rap for the same reason, honestly, that a lot of white kids grow up listening to rap, right? They sort of, especially maybe like in that time for, let's say, the 90s. 90s culture, right, is so, like, in some ways it's very colorful, and in other ways it's very dead, right? So this kind of like grand illusion. So many things were a grand illusion, whether it's like the prosperity of the 90s was a grand illusion. Some of the kind of perks of globalization was a grand illusion. Politically, like, the New Democrats, that was a grand illusion. This idea of like some rebirth or renewal, that didn't happen. But a lot of kids, are listening to rap probably because it's one of the few things, especially then, that is not just like flat out sterile. Like, one of the reasons why I still appreciate rap, even if I don't listen to music in general all that much anymore, uh, there's this kind of like hyper competitive streak between rappers, and it's considered normal. And the reason why it's considered normal is, the backgrounds of many rappers, the stakes of masculinity are much higher, right? You have to always prove something to someone, right? Your masculinity works very different in that world than it might in other worlds. And
Yeah.
if that's in fact the case, you being a rapper means that you are saying something about yourself, you're saying something about your talents, and not only do you want other people to recognize this about you, you're also willing to defend it, right? You could either defend it by words, in terms of, if somebody, like, I don't know, does like a negative album review, you might, explain why that's wrong, right? Which is considered, very abnormal, like in the arts, right? Normal, you're supposed to not respond to that. Or as it is between other artists, right? Between rappers, you engage in a rap battle, right? To prove, actually, I am better with words than you are. And oftentimes there's this other kind of intersection there where it's not merely a matter of whether or not you're more talented. It's, are you, like a real man? Like, the thing like a few years ago with Drake and Pusha T, where Drake had a child with this Instagram model that he was hiding from the world,
I
and
remember
Pusha
that.
and Pusha T, like, he approaching this from a kind of like, uh, black male perspective that's, all about the children. He sees that as a failing, not only of like the black community, but here it's being kind of instantiated in Drake, right? A
Yeah.
guy that is constantly rapping about needing to treat women well, and so on and so forth. And so, these things bleed into one another. But there's not many cultures out there that are, is in the arts at least, that are so kind of adamant about things like, there is a good and a bad, and we can prove it. There's a good and a bad, and I'm going to show it to you. And in an audience, right, that not only cultivates this mindset, but absolutely goes for it, right? The whole classic thing with, like, Eminem in the early 2000s with that 8 Mile movie, like, oh, he's out there like
Yeah.
proving himself, right? You don't have that kind of shit in, like, R&B, or like just generic singing or whatever, right? But and I've those values that I cultivated listening to rap as a kid, they carried over very, very easily into the art world, where I immediately knew. I remember, like, when I read County Cullen's poetry as a teenager, I was like, I know this is great fucking poetry, and I need to figure out why I have this thought. I need to find a way to prove this. Why is this great? When I read Kazuo Ishiguro's Remains of the Day, that
Mm.
became immediately my favorite novel. And I was like, this is such a great novel. And I wish I had the education and the verbal acuity to be able to say why. That became a kind of project. So, it was a very easy transition. In fact, like, the only reason I even started reading books was, there was this album by this underground rapper Raskaz from 1996 called Soul on Ice.
Yeah.
And I was a big fan of this album, and I learned, listening to it, that the title was taken from Eldridge Cleaver's
Yeah.
book Soul on Ice from the '60s. So I was like, all right, this is interesting enough for me to want to check out. I went to the library, I checked this book out, and it's a first book that I read in like 2 days. Usually it would take me like weeks or months to finish a book. And I read that book in.
It's interesting you say that, because I think about hip hop, like 90s hip hop, for a moment being quite literary in sense of, like, you know, there's stuff like Wu-Tang Clan who would do songs about that would reference, you know, algebra and constellations and what have you, and you know, there's sometimes kind of like books that were quite you know, sort of book, you know, I mean, the sort of stuff you get in like Black Panther libraries, you know, that sort of stuff, like the Book of the Dead, or what have you know. You could have quite a lot of esoterica in rap music, especially, you know, the influence comic books, you know, and sort of pulp media and sort of ninja films, like that, all these interesting cultural syntheses. You know, you have like New York rappers making music that was referencing the Far East and you know, the Fantastic Four. It just seemed like quite an interesting, you know, it's the beginning of like all the culture jamming and stuff you get in the 90s, you know, all this quite interesting dialectical stuff happening, you know, East and West, past and future, and what have you. So, so I think that is almost like seen as like a renaissance for rap music in a big way. Kind of even though like the music has this kind of primitive charm in its production, kind of, you know, the boom bap stuff and the samples, although that itself has now a kind of it has a kind of signature sort of retro vibe to it, kind of with nostalgia, like a boom bap nostalgia that's back around again and periodically comes back around again. But my first encounter with hip hop was kind of British hip hop, kind of like sort of like native kind of UK grime stuff, and I always made the connection in my head between sort of UK grime, which was sometimes called garage, between that and the garage rock that happened in the 60s. Which, you know, and the beginning of punk, you know, teenagers setting up stuff out of their garages, out of their bedrooms, buying equipment. They can only play 3 or 4 chords, and boom, DIY, you have a band. And like now you have teenagers in these council estates. I mean, in Britain it's council estates. I'm sure you know, the projects in American cities and other places, but it's council estates and high rises, Ballardian high rises in Britain, and that's kind of where all the grime music, it's people making stuff out of their council tenements, kind of with you know, European sort of DJ kits and sort of.
Was it good? Was it good or what?
Yeah, I mean, it is good. I mean, it's I think some of the early stuff, and it has a kind of I mean, compared to kind of American rap music, which is kind of much more kind of sartorial, I think sometimes it is. I think British rap music is much more kind of musical and much more almost kind of like kind of like theatrical. It's very odd. I can almost call it like kabuki. Grime is like very kind of like very exaggerated voices and stuff like that. But the big problem I always had with kind of grime and with American hip hop was kind of, I mean, you know, it's a popular kind of very masculine thing, but that comes with its good and its bad things. It's also, paradoxically, rap music is a beloved music of racists and idiots and you know, what have you. Same with rock music and metal, you know, so like there's all these like innovative things that can happen there, but it starts to become representative of the kind of norm culture we're talking about. And so same thing with reggae, you know, like there's always been reggae that I've listened to, and then or even happy hardcore music, you know, I listen to some, but then I meet people on public transport who are like just absolutely.
Did you listen to Bunny Wailer growing up?
Listen to any what?
Bunny Wailer?
Bunny Boiler, I think it rings a bell.
Bunny Wailer, yeah, like, you know, I grew up like also like with a little bit of a reggae, I guess, but you know, it's interesting because you know, everything that we're talking about, I think is true. At the same time, like I guess the irony is that a lot of what you mentioned as positives eventually led for me, you know, with my kind of like disillusionment with like a lot of, if not most rap, even stuff that I was, you know, really big on growing up. Like, for example, like you're mentioning, you know, the fact that it's very, especially a lot of 90s rap is very literate. It's making all these kind of, you know, esoteric references. But at a certain point, you know, one of the biggest shortcomings of rap as a genre is it's so reflexive, right? It's so self-referential and it's so dependent on a very kind of limited repertoire of things that, on the one hand, lots of stuff becomes very dated very quickly, a lot of these references.
Don't you find as well the kind of that repertory of sort of stuff, it gets turned into things like we have nowadays, like, Kendrick Lamar and that musical, the one about Alexander Hamilton.
The Lin-Manuel Miranda, You listen
to albums by Kendrick Lamar, and it just seems so unbearably sincere, and it wears its heart on its sleeves, and it's so pious. It's, the biograph, confessional, kind of like, I survived the hood, now I have survivor's guilt. All these faithful samples.
And that's why.
Tupac. It's just so. It could be a parody. It's
that's why I still kind of like, it's odd, but I at this point now I tend to prefer like some like 90s gangster rap that's like maybe a little bit, I don't want to say like less literate, because even with gangster rap I would prefer something that's more literate, but there's less of that kind of, there might be a posturing of a certain kind going on, but it's less of that kind of, really woke consciousness posturing, right? Like when conscious rap became like this big thing in like the mid to late 2000s, that's kind of when it reached, a lot of its kind of well, I don't want to say apex, because it didn't reach its kind of like critical literary heights or anything, but it reached its apex in terms of like, the public imagination, right? And rap being so kind of self-referential, so reflexive, when I read Soul and Ice and the book, and I just kept like a notebook for writing down words and writing down concepts, names, events that I didn't know, which was like most of the stuff being mentioned by Eldridge Cleaver. And little by little, I would fill out these books, and I continued, with that habit for a few years. Just, anything I'd come across that I didn't know, I would look it up. And very quickly, that led me to literature, right? More broadly, that led me to so many other things. And I guess because I became so kind of infatuated with reading, I just didn't have time to listen to music. And after reading like a ton of like great poetry, and then like discovering Cosmoetica or whatever, you go back to a lot of 90s rap, and I'm sorry, like the fact that it's so dependent on itself and it's so reflexive, it is a limitation that is self-imposed in rap, right? So a lot of it just starts to not really stack up against the best literature, right? Which I guess it's not rap's fault. I mean, you can't expect music to stack up against the best literature, because literature is literature, music is music, right? They do different things, and they could do different things well. But because rap, some of the best rap tends to be so self-consciously, I wish to be literate, I wish to be talented, I wish to be poetic, that becomes its own trap, because then you're sort of...
There are rappers in the UK like that for sure. I mean, rappers in America like Immortal Technique as well, like with just the overbearing preachiness as well of the music, where kind of like you'll listen to songs by them and you'll be like, oh, I've heard
non-political Immortal Technique is at his best when he's just doing like really kind of grimy type of shit, sexist. And that's the thing, like some of his best music is his like most sexist music, right? Because if you can't stomach the political stuff because it's too preachy, or you can't stomach the more kind of self-consciously literate stuff because it wants to be poetry too much and it's not, then what you have left is you have some of that hyper masculine posturing, which, I mean, it can be done in a way that's witty, it can be done in a way that's that's good, but it's also, again, it's also very limiting, right? Some of the best, gangster rap is rap that is very kind of high on its own self-destructiveness, right? And that kind of irony there, like really works.
I totally agree. I love kind of 3-6 Mafia kind of stuff, almost like Grand Guignol kind of rap, or or someone like Big Lurch, I Did It To You, these kind of like very Dracula kind of songs. I think that, it's tough to kind of do the tongue-in-cheek but also kind of serious, speculative kind of lyrics. You have to walk a delicate line. You have to have a good sense of irony. You have to have a clever kind of narrative voice. Someone like Serge Gainsbourg could do these sort of things, because, in his songs, there was often kind of an unreliable narrator, or the songs didn't ask you to, the songs were quite at home with having a dubious morality, and you just accept that. I think with other people, it's a bit more tricky, like with Immortal Technique, where, I think, sometimes it gets turned into a bit of a pose, and it becomes, it sort of defeats any underlying political sort of force or message that's supposed to have. Which is to say, actually, I mean, I don't actually agree with many of his political ideas, but certainly like a song like Dance with the Devil, and although that's become a meme kind of in the last few years, with kind of I react to videos of shocking rap lyrics, that sort of shit. I mean, that's a clever sort of thing where kind of at the end there's a kind of Gil Martin-esque sort of device where he turns to the listener and he sort of speaks to them directly, and there's like there seems to be a kind of Robert Browning My Last Duchess thing going on where it seems quite clever, but you don't get that in a lot of hip hop, and you don't even get that a lot from sometimes from the same artists. So like hip hop can't really get out from under its own folk traditions in an odd way, and that could be because it's a young thing, but I think it's also, it's a victim of kind of the internet and the fact that kind of hip hop used to be very localized and very about kind of lyrics made references to very particular local things, which is why, I mean, you get rap in France now where no one listens to it outside of that particular like Toulouse, because it's so, even the lyrics are so specific to people living in Toulouse, but now, like in our global culture, people are making rap in Britain, which sounds like rap from Nashville. People are making rap in,
and that's very, very specific to rap, right? The fact that it's so referential to like its cities, right? Its neighborhoods. I used to love I had to spend a few years in New Jersey, away from New York City, and I remember like listening to like New York City rap, and references to like things that I knew about, streets that I would be on, stuff that anyone outside of like my locale, right, they wouldn't know what it's about. And that's very, very specific to rap, right? Like if you have like a southern rap, like they're talking about very specific kind of things. And like
they cross over though in a way, kind of like the idiolect and the dialect of certain things cross over. I mean, now I hear people in England using Americanisms that are quite clearly taken from the rap music they listen to, and what have you. But I mean, that goes beyond kind of the whole thing. I mean, culture as costume. I mean, even in the 60s, the Rolling Stones. I mean, Mick Jagger is basically doing his best impression of a black gay man from the South. He's acting like Howlin' Wolf. And this is a guy from the East End of London. And that translates, in a big. And this is happening all the time, I think, which is why kind of the idea of, for me, the idea of cultural appropriation thing is a total red herring. It goes on all the time anyway.
What I mean, like, what is this like the fact is, like, functionally no one can even really define what that is going to look like. I mean, if cultural appropriation has become even like you cannot make like dishes and put them on YouTube from the culture that you weren't born into, like, it's just insane, right? What are you supposed to do? You're not supposed to. There was like this one thing where like someone like wrote into some kind of advice column about like his kid learning Spanish in school and how offensive he found this, and how he was insisting like you cannot speak Spanish anywhere outside of school, right? If you have to do it in class, go ahead, but I will not have you speaking. And like this is this is like the exact opposite of cultural respect, right? And ultimately, I have some ideas about like books in the future. Like I definitely want to write like some kind of like big rap novel, right? From the
rap it like your 8 Mile.
Well, from the perspective of one of these regionally famous, locally famous rappers, right? That like for many of these types of people, it's like the extent of their world becomes the regional fame, right? Or it becomes like their concerts, right? And it makes me wonder, like, imagine putting a person like that that is, has lots of positive qualities, right? Is literate, is intelligent, and yet, imagine kind of like an ever escalating, set of absurd situations that this person has to deal with, right? And it's going to be written from the perspective of a Black person. Of course, I'm going to use dirty language that white people aren't supposed to use. But I mean, the way that I think about it is like this.
I'm fascinated by white rappers. I'm
Yeah.
fascinated. I mean, like the whole concept of whiteness in hip hop is fascinating to me.
What do you think about Eminem? Because I also have like ideas about that. Like it's just like a lot of like how race intersects with rap. Like it's very interesting, especially whiteness, right?
I often think of Eminem as bloated. Do you know what I mean? I think he's kind of this sort of bloated because he's one of these people like Madonna, isn't he? He's like this iconic figure who kind of, for somewhere, we're not quite sure, he became canonical. No one's opinion can touch him, even after he puts out these disastrous albums. Like he kind of lamely kind of like goes, well, I'm Eminem. That's good enough for me. Everyone goes, oh well, he's Eminem, I suppose. You know what I mean? Iconic status. Fucking hell. That means you don't have to try anymore.
I think the most telling thing about this, like recently that I came across, was I was walking around my neighborhood, and I don't see white people that often, at least some of the streets that I take my walks on. And I saw, like, it's just so weird, right? So the first white person in that area that I saw in a while happened to be this guy who's probably around my age, honestly. Definitely white, had like this big beard, had like a hoodie on. And the reason why I saw him is because he had his phone out, and from his phone he had as loud as possible that Eminem song, The Way I Am. And it's like, this is so like, okay, so first of all, like, that song specifically, it's like when you listen to it now, it's terrible production, or like it's like the first song that Eminem produced, and it's so like exactly what you expect from like the very late 90s or early 2000s, like this extremely repetitive sort of beat that it's supposed to be like foreboding, but it just sounds cheap and nasty. And the lyrics I just
don't like the way that there are some artists whose entire career has just been sounding aggressive for really no reason.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly. And in that song, like all he's doing is he's just fucking, like, what is he complaining about? He's complaining about, okay, so he's on a record label and they're putting pressure on him to like outdo the sales of his last single or whatever. He's complaining about being, like accosted by fans everywhere that he goes. He's like screaming about this. And it's so like, I think calling him Madonna in that sense is kind of prescient, right? Because, you are acting, like one of these like prima donna singers. And like the fact that this white guy was walking down the street looking the way that he looked, honestly looking the way that I looked when I was 13, when I was 14, when I was 15, right? I had cut up eyebrows, I had pierced ears. I mean, still do. I just don't wear earrings anymore.
I had a mohawk when I was 16.
We're like dipping into like, the identity subcultures, and he's blasting the song. This guy, like my age now, he probably grew up with the song just like I did, but he probably never got over it emotionally, right? He's walking down the street. He wants everybody to hear the song. He wants to be seen in this kind of light. And he probably has the same kind of set of complaints with the same kind of equally low stakes, right? And like I recently re-listened to some of his like early like classic albums. Like if you look at the reviews for something like the Slim Shady LP or the Marshall Mathers LP, they're supposed to be classics, and I think there's some good songs on Marshall Mathers LP, but listening to that first album, it's just so bad. There's almost no good song, and even the songs that are, I guess, kind of good in the kind of pop sense of the word good, it's just very cheap, right? The lyrics are just really bad most of the time, right?
Something never clicked with me with Eminem.
Yeah,
like even
even growing up, I kept them at an arm's length for whatever reason.
It wasn't even a kind of reflexive, like, oh, that's pop, that's commercial.
Yeah,
because I would listen to like the Black Eyed Peas, like something like "Shut Up" is a really good kind of like a banger, like a catchy pop song. But Eminem, it always just seemed kind of like again, it was kind of the aggressiveness, the anger, that kind of. I mean, nowadays you see these suburban teenagers, black, white, what have you, but they're about 16, 17 years old, and they're making these songs which are just a blasted out bass, and like every other word is fuck, and it's like, this is just because your mum sent you to your fucking room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like, why are you angry? Just what it's almost, it just become, because, well, the answer is because that's what hip hop is now. It's it's just kind of like, it's become that kind of default thing where it's just like, that's the songs where you get aggressive and you start to like talk about how people don't want to fuck with you, and it's like, who lives like that? If we all lived like that, it would just be like fucking carnage. I don't know.
And not to take too much away from Eminem, I think in general he hasn't been artistically successful, as a rapper. Although obviously, hugely commercially successful and very influential. But I mean, he has legitimately good songs. Songs like "Stan," even a song like like "White America." I mean, he's saying things about he's saying things about racial politics or small p politics that most people don't in rap, and especially like black rappers wouldn't have said in the way that he said it, right? So it's good to have these kinds of perspectives from so-called I don't want to call them outsiders, because I mean, what are we talking about? Are you an outsider to hip hop because you're not black? Right? You're an outsider perhaps in other ways as well, but I don't want to take too much away from him, but I think he's an interesting case in point in that perhaps what he's most remembered for is not necessarily the stuff that's his best.
I link him in my head not so much with rap, but with kind of like Marilyn Manson. Do you know what I mean? Kind of that cultural moment of sort of new metal in a way. Kind of like the white guys with cornrows and that sort of stuff. Sort of scatting over metal.
And also it's like intentions, like what is it, like what was it trying to do? Because like in White America, Eminem has this set of lines that I think is like very spot on, right? He's saying that all these white kids are listening to him for no discernible reason, right? He calls it this anger that sprays and sprays in every direction and no direction, right? It's not and like when you think about it, like the kind of like political, again, small p political stuff that he was involved in. I mean, what was it in the late 90s and early 2000s? It was Congress is trying to censor my music, right? It's, we can't say the shit that we want to say on TV. We can't say curse words. We can't use, slurs. The satanic panics from the 80s even into the 2000s, right? Like, oh my God.
The 90s, the satanic panic, and what else was there? The Columbine too.
Doom, right? Like all games like Doom, right? Intersecting with all that.
Natural Born Killers.
All
that stuff. Kind of the whole anxiety, the moral panic, all that sort of stuff. And that's nothing new in a way. It really kind of we maybe it is symptomatic of modernism, but it's certainly nothing new as far as we're concerned. I think. I mean, like when you were mentioning rap turning you onto literature in different ways, that reminded me of musical influences from my childhood too. Bands like Marquis Smith's The Fall, which are a sort of Northern England rock band, very literary, very good, very esoteric, but also people like David Bowie, and his numerous references to literature, but also his collaboration with different people throughout his career who themselves were kind of very interesting. And the way it dovetails, he almost becomes like a signpost for different cultural things. And he's very much using his stardom to do that at the beginning of his career anyhow, kind of like those first chameleonic stages of his career. But and then this problem of his attraction and repulsion to America. At certain points his career becomes very Americanized. He rejects it, he returns to it. So that whole thing was very formative for me as a child, because like I got turned on to like stuff like Jean Genet and Burroughs and Brian Eno and people like that, all through David Bowie, and also stuff like I believe who's the chap who also wrote the Younger Toners,
Is
Well,
that a German phrase you just
no,
said?
is it Christopher Isherwood and people like that, and
Oh,
like authors like that? These Yukio Mishima. These are people who all referenced
okay.
in David Bowie's like lyrics. You know, so that became quite informative in that way. And you know, so from a very young age, I kind of had this idea of the arts as being quite incestuous in that way, of kind of like in the way that different things could turn you onto other things, and how the limit of one medium could open up the space of possibility for another, where you know, songs about paintings about ideas that are from literature or from what have you. So that's why from very young age, kind of I was, when I was very young, I wanted to be an author and I wanted to illustrate my own novels, which is charming. But I saw, you know, I very much saw them as having some kind of you know, I didn't, you know, I liked the idea of multimedia dabbling in different things and seeing crossovers between them. I mean, like, do you probably have the sense of that too then, kind of like coming out of like what you were listening to and then go reading other things through that? Am I wrong?
Yeah. I mean, just in general, like I always imagined. I mean, I started with poetry, right? I mean, I wrote a bunch of poetry. In fact, it's going to be more relevant a little bit later in this conversation. But I've started to write poetry again recently. You know, working on a new novel now. I have plans right after that for a book of short stories. I was really actually into drawing as a kid. I was actually very good at it when I was, you know, maybe 10, 11, 12. And that's more or less the time that I stopped. And then when I discovered writing, I was like, this is, you know, this is exactly what I want to do. But I always imagine, you know, like with books that you do, like you always have to do things differently, right? Because I mean, when I was growing up, and I mean, I'm still this way now, I didn't have like that many close friends. I don't really like leaving my house all that much, right? I just, you know, I just mostly like being by myself. I need a lot of solitude. If I, you know, if I interact with someone, even this kind of conversation, right, I'm gonna have to be, you know, after like a few hours of this, I'm going to have to be very silent tomorrow, right? I can't have people talking to me. I'm not going to be answering emails and shit. I'm going to be, you know, I'm just going to be, you know, doing other things and recharging, reading, whatever. And, you know, but if you're in that mindset and you're doing a lot of reading and you want to be like an artist of some sort, you start thinking, you know, my peers are not the peers of other people. It's true that I don't have, you know, for example, that many friends, but I could have my peers to be Eldridge Cleaver. You know, what if I could do a political book better than he did? You know, I'm reading County Cullen. That is my peer. I have to be able to excel some poetry like this, right? I have people that I could look up to. I have people that I could take stuff from, and I have people that I could potentially excel in some way, right? And I think that's a kind of healthy approach because you're not localizing your interactions like wherever that you are, right? You're not limiting yourself to whatever your circumstances are. You are kind of always working at the highest level that you can. And if that's your perspective, especially now, like, you know, like growing up in the 90s or whatever, you're going to have some sort of like multimedia kind of angle in your brain, kind of like already built in, right? You always want to try to do different kinds of things again and again. And, you know, this is, I guess, true in general, like to anybody born in the 20th or 21st centuries.
Yeah, I am. When you mentioned I do want to bring, because at the very beginning we were talking about, or we alluded to the like political art and kind of sort of art's relation to politics and what have you. You said a political book. I mean, like, do you think there is such a thing, or you know, as an apolitical art then, or do you think I mean, at what level does the politics kind of interact with the art?
Well, I mean, you in their emails, you said something like, you know, the opening line, maybe that could be like the controlling metaphor for the conversation, right? It was something like art's freedoms versus society's freedoms, or put another way, art for art's sake, and what that might mean politically, right? Because it's true that if you say art for art's sake, there might still be some sort of if that's not a political comment in and of itself, it's still going to have some sort of relationship to politics, even if it's not in that kind of crass, bloviating way that is typically thought of as, all art is political, right?
Yeah.
Well, so first of all, like art for art's sake, right? I guess it depends on how that word art is defined and what you really mean by for its own sake, right? Because I was before this conversation, I was looking at some paintings by Odd Nerdrum, that Norwegian painter. And I mean, look, I think he has some good paintings, but he definitely has a bunch of paintings that are, you could theoretically say, okay, this is an example of art for art's sake. You have like two creatures, humanoid types, let's say, coming out of the water, right, with this kind of like fantastical background, and one shoots the other. Maybe I need to spend a little more time with this painting, but when I just saw it, I quickly glanced at it, it struck me as, okay, so this is an example of something that someone could say is art for art's sake, meaning it's almost purely decorative. It's kind of kitschy in the sense that people could easily say, oh, I like this, so right, I could enjoy that. I could get something very superficial out of it, right? Maybe perhaps even hanging up on my wall or something like that. But if you're saying that is an example of art for art's sake, it's only that by like pure inflation, right? You're really inflating things unnecessarily, right? Because I mean, it's still decorative, you know what I mean? And the other part is, art may comment on politics directly or might not. The way that I view it is that's just kind of an aesthetic position that someone takes. Perhaps it's even a moral position that someone takes, but it's not something that is necessarily preferred or not preferred in a work of art, right? Having politics or not having politics in art, it's not going to detract from potential greatness or the lack of it, right? So that's just kind of the ways that I would start breaking apart that question.
Yeah, I think those seem apt because I feel also kind of slightly agnostic about this term, sort of art for art's own sake, because does that mean sort of the art's freedom or the art's self-definition? I mean, what necessarily is the art? I mean, I suppose it's a whole teleology, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If you think art for its own sake, then you have it, that involves some kind of first of all, I mean, I think like when we talk about art for art's sake, when I say we, I mean you and me and everyone else who will say art for art's sake today. They're really meaning it in a Trotskyist way. They're certainly don't mean it in a Ruskinian way or anything like that. I think Trotsky.
How would you differentiate those two?
Like, Ruskin is much more of a Kantian in this sense. He thinks that he gives lip service to the idea of art for art's sake, but he still believes that art should, in a way, be
like a moralizing force in some like distant way.
Like beauty should be a symbol for life, some ethical symbol like that. Whereas Trotsky, for one thing, Trotsky, I think it's in that moment between Trotsky and Stalin that you really get kind of the birth of modern art for art's sake, where I have some notes actually to this effect. And it's all kind of the big problem of for instance, Trotsky says that art is a protest against reality. He says that that art is the most sensitive part of culture, it's the most sensitive and complex part of culture, and that it suffers the most from the decline and the decay of bourgeois society. So in that way, cultural decline and political strife and upheaval, I mean, these are the larger contexts for art. And although, so there's this idea that art is a high culture, but that, it's at some level, there is a connection between its freedom, its freedom and political freedom, sort of social freedom. But there's a paradox here. and it is that, you know, it is this idea of kind of form and content, this idea of style versus politics, right? So Trotsky also says that, so he says that art is an important part of kind of helping in the struggle for the freedom of oppressed classes, and that sort of a politically conscious and historically conscious art can help to scatter what he calls the skepticism and pessimism of mankind. But he says also, in this slightly paradoxical way, art can become a strong ally of the revolution only insofar as it remains faithful to itself. So this somehow implies that in a way, kind of all the politics follows on from some sort of formal aesthetic foundational basis. And this is also mirrored in what Walter Benjamin says, when he makes a differentiation between artistic qualities and political tendencies. And he went so far as to assert that art could not be of the correct political tendency or incorrect or otherwise if it failed to have formal aesthetic quality. Such quality was educative in value. It demonstrated and educated the potential transformation of the aesthetic form itself for the both viewer and producer. And this is where the fissure begins between Trotsky and the Russian formalists and Stalin, where sort of the formalists are microscopically obsessed with design and etiquette and shall we say, with technique to the exclusion of lots of other contingencies. And Trotsky criticized the formalists, and he said the methods of formal analysis are necessary but insufficient because they neglect the social world with which the human beings who write and read literature are bound up in. And so the whole question becomes, oh God, how does formalism square up with real life? If you're looking at things through a microscope, perhaps you lose the context of society and what have you. So you know, there's this struggle that Trotsky is in with kind of the whole legacy of Kant and Hegel here, where there's this whole question kind of whether art can resolve the ills of society or society's ills through art or society or vice versa, you know. So I mean, and that's the whole conundrum right there as well. I mean, and Greenbergian formalism comes out of that. But then in the whole process, in the last 50 years, we've had a whole period where we've become disenchanted with Greenbergian formalism. It looks like just another form of American imperialism, just another form of capitalism. And now kind of we've gone back to square one, where we're sort of almost back to this point again, where we have these ideas where we're squaring up form versus content, style versus politics. Mao actually talks about this, and this is his little red book. Mao talks about, let me see here. He talked about this in terms of the struggle on two fronts. That's his work, and he said, quote, and he seems to be more in Trotsky's position here, but ultimately we know he gives into a Stalinist sort of, he says, works of art which lack artistic quality have no force, however progressive they are politically. Oh, that's just an interesting thing for Mao to say. He says, therefore we oppose works of art with wrong political viewpoints, but with no artistic qualities. But what do we see happen with Mao? It's the same thing that happens with Stalin. The tendency becomes towards a poster and slogan style, correct in political viewpoint, lacking in artistic power. And, you know, and even there, this is a sort of a strange schema to think in. Even now, when we think in this formulation of politics and content stuff, we come into some problems, don't we? Because we'd have, if we just run through it, if we think, you know, what are works of art which are poor stylistically but full of bad politics? What are the examples that come to mind?
Yeah, that's sort of what I would talk about. We should get to Greenberg right after this.
Okay. Hang on, like, if you just there's what are also the works of art which are poor stylistically but contain good politics, you know, or works of art which are rich stylistically but full of evil politics, unprogressive politics. You know, one might talk about Wagner, or you know, but we could argue, you know, works of art also which are rich stylistically but embrace progressive politics. Who are those guys?
Yeah.
And this is just the thing, Mao doesn't talk about this. He doesn't try to systematize this. But who are these people? You know, we could talk about John Cage, although he was just an anarchist, or something, you know, something like that. You know, it's true. But sorry, you were going to talk about Greenberg.
Oh, well, we should just get to Greenberg after this response, because this isn't necessarily having to do with Greenberg, but I mean, so the question of is there this tension between formalism in writing and formalism in critique
Mm,
versus like social comment? I mean, like when I think about just like great books, Kazuo Ishiguro's Remains of the Day, that
yeah.
has social commentary. A lot of it is wrapped up in, you see the interactions between I think his name's Mr. Stevens,
Mm,
and I forget her, Miss Kelton, I think her name is. You see their kind of interactions and sub interactions. You see the fact that Stevens has kind of like dismissed so much of his emotional life to become a great butler.
yeah.
That is, a social comment. That is a small p political comment. A lot of that commentary is sort of spot on, I guess, about the way that people live their lives. There's also an undercurrent of commentary about fascism. I mean, it's set during the rise of Hitler, for example, and let's say books by a Nazi. So Newt Hampson is a novelist. He has some pretty good novels. I think his best book is The Growth of the Soil. Now, this is a Nazi, but you can't really find, like to the extent that you could find Nazi politics and Growth of the Soil, those Nazi politics are more kind of like in that spiritual aspect of, how like, Nazism tried to sort of do its own kind of myth making,
Mm,
right? The first man, the powerful man, the Germanic man, the man of culture that sort of comes along and disciplines everything and everyone. And in Growth of the Soil, right, you have this kind of man that comes out of nowhere. He decides to build a house on this land. This woman comes out of nowhere as if it's kind of, predetermined, as if it's predestined. She joins him simply because he is a man and he shows himself to be a man that is perhaps worthwhile in some ways, a hard worker. She
yeah.
comes along and she kind of fulfills his destiny. I could definitely see, different strains of like Nazi culture taking certain lessons away from that in the same way that you could take Nietzsche like into Nazi
Mm,
culture, but there is no overt Nazi comment. Now,
yeah.
can I think of like a Nazi, like a true like Nazi politics novel that is also a great book? I
Uh,
guess, but it's generally not going to be a problem that human beings have to deal with because the if you think of like the greatest possible artists, right? I think it's sort of telling that Dan, on the one hand, is as a great Dan Schneider for anybody that doesn't know who we're talking about of Cosmoetica. It's kind of telling that Dan Schneider is on the one hand a great artist that has like a really great work ethic, and also in his personal life, he's always been kind of like a stand up man, right? The line that he always gets made fun of for is not only like it was a line that was, I guess, referencing himself. It was something like, not only was he a great artist, he was also a great man. At a certain point, if you are pathological, right, and pathological enough to become obsessed with something like Nazi ideology, that will probably interfere with your artwork. I know that that's kind of like a crass way of putting it. It's imperfect because, of course, we're going to have exceptions. Birth of a Nation is a great film, and yet it is arguing for lots of negative things. But you generally don't have that all that much. And when it comes to just great writing in general, great art, there's always something going on psychologically. There's always some sort of comment on, just like even if we start from the assumption that great novel writing has to start somewhere with characterization, right? The building up of characters, like forget world building for a second. Why don't you build the character first? And the world that he's either jutting up against, or the world that is implied by a person in this character. You need to start with that first, but by doing that, you're going to have to reveal so much about human behavior and interaction and give so much to readers that in some ways it is a little bit, I guess, of a political comment, but not in that, not in the, capital P way, right? It's just, it's so, I don't think on some level you could truly divorce that. And also on another level, like, I'm always kind of resistant about this idea of like, morality in art, right? Like ethics in art, right? Because that's always a slippery slope. But the more that I read, people like Nietzsche, I definitely see a place for ethics in art, but not in the kind of typical way. When Nietzsche says something like, I want a morality that is not based on forbidding you to do anything, but a morality that goads you to act, to do one thing that you're best at, that you're great at, and do it again and again and again from morning till night until you dream of it when you sleep. That is a perfect encapsulation for how a great artist needs to approach their craft, right? And there is a kind of ought implied there. If you're a great artist, you ought to be out there making great art, right? You shouldn't be doing something else, especially if that something else is subpar, right? If you're, a mediocre journalist versus a great novelist, you have to be that great novelist. So there is this kind of ought, and there is this kind of, I guess more kind of like a meta ethics that finds itself, right, in art. If you really think about it, even if you want to resist the most kind of, asinine versions of these arguments.
Yeah, I agree. I think aesthetics must have something to do with ethics because it involves making judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so often kind of the way we think about ethics in art is about what the art must literally propose, what it literally represents. I think this is a very crass and often dilettantish way to look at art, what the art condones. And I think it is representative of people who, like we were talking, we were just referencing kind of Nietzsche and kind of his idea of sort of, a bit basically Nietzsche is pro-alterity in a big way. I mean, he is not for inhibition in any way, and as opposed to Kantianism, which is all about inhibition and anti-alterity, managing alterity. I think the thing with politics and with art is that, because, and we touched on like the idea of sort of a CCP, Maoist, Stalinist art, the posters and the slogans.
Mm-hmm.
In what way is that politics? What does that do politically? Very often it doesn't do anything. It just flatters the ruling party, and it's a form of chic. It's a form of radical chic for the party. In their society, it's another consumer item. Mm-hmm. And it certainly means nothing in a post-revolutionary society. It can account for the unique problems that our society and art faces today. So, I think very often like the real subversive political content isn't in a slogan, kind of in a painting or what have you. It's often encoded, whatever that might mean. It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be as pretentiously sort of displayed like that. But also the fact that art, it's much harder to gain what the politics of the artworks are than, say, the politics of the artist. An artist might be evil, but is his art evil? An artist might be a rabid misogynist, but are his paintings misogynist? This is the thing. In what way does kind of our biases and our pathological our pathological biases, our discriminations make their way into our art, and then what does the art do to them? Because we've seen all kinds of Puritan, anti-modernistic people create quite startling works of modern art. Cézanne, for instance, a very backward kind of guy. H.P. Lovecraft, even, the accidental modernists who think they're neoclassicists. It's very interesting there, kind of the schizophrenic quality. It's not intentional all the time. And this is precisely, what Kant hated about art. It's impersonal, lack of intentionality. It's lack of a kind of a pathological intensive purpose in that sense. And it's why he assigns it the label genius, almost like a band-aid. People talk about the concept of Kantian genius. Kant is quite happy to downplay the role of aesthetics in his overall philosophy and to treat it as a marginal problematic in an already rigorous philosophical system of logicism. Art doesn't gel well with that, because there's some sense that it's not intentional. It seems any kind of creative force that lacks that intentionality, that purpose, and that kind of pathology he doesn't like. So genius is kind of a band-aid, and he puts it on that. But you see with Nietzsche, like, and I really want to talk about Nietzsche now because you brought it up. But Nietzsche's whole concept that he brings out of Schopenhauer as well is this idea of, like you were saying, will. What if the art, I mean, this is mainly taken from Eastern aesthetics and Buddhism and what have you, kind of everything and nothing and all that sort of stuff, but will in place of reason as a sort, a trans individual sort of creative force, that kind of, Nietzsche describes the world as, quote, a work of art that gives birth to itself. And he thinks of it in these terms. It's a concept, teleoplexy, which is what Guy Deleuze and people like Nick Land love about Nietzsche. Life on Earth as a planetary artistic experiment. And so he takes that from Schopenhauer and the idea that genius and creativity is the function of this surplus of our intensive purposiveness, that we can create and make all these things, it's and primarily the purposelessness and the unintelligibility of this process, the fact that we can't say anything about it in advance, is solely what gives it its meaning. This is what Nietzsche makes very clear, in total opposition to Kantian logicism. Like, it is the lack of purpose, and the only thing one can say about it beforehand is sort of the Das Übermenschen, or the Superman. That's his idea for the artist, for the creative, for the philosopher, for the new man, the tyro of the future. And I think that's an amazing sort of continuation. I mean, Nietzsche gets kind of lost in what happens in Greenbergianism. He's sort of confined to the margins, and it's mainly Trotsky and then Kant later. But I'm very much interested in Nietzschean aesthetics, in that sense.
I wanted to respond to something you were saying about like this kind of Nietzschean idea of art benefits in a sense from its own kind of lack of purpose. And
purposelessness is the word I seem to recall.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's true in some ways, but the way that I've grown to think about things, it relates to the name of my channel, Automachination. Right. The tagline is "the process before life's a process begins." When I originally started this channel, I was going to put other stuff on it that I've done, like, I do coding for like literary analysis or whatever. I was going to do like these like tutorial how-tos, because you don't really see stuff like that, right? Especially, literary analysis with programming from someone that's actually, I'm an actual critic, right? I'm an actual artist. But my brain goes too many directions. I need to control myself and just do what I really need to do, which is kind of like what we're doing now. Yeah. But the idea behind automachination, besides this kind of like, I guess, techie sort of little element to it, is, at a certain point, right, when it comes to something like art and artistic judgment, I feel like things of their own accord more or less become a given. And that's true even if you could technically say, well, there is no actual purpose, right? Because human beings create that purpose, right? And that's one of the main advantages, right? You don't have that in so many aspects of life, except for art, right? Where you have much more control over what you do. On another level, though, things do kind of like take their own shape. Like what I think of, like, well, if I could like describe like, an ideal kind of artistic theory, like if you want to call it that, although I'm not really in the business of that kind of stuff either, but if I were to sort of go into this like realm of philosophy, I would talk about, things that have an additive quality, right? I mean, most recently when I started writing poetry again, I was very much reminded of the fact that, more than kind of like anything else that you could do, it really, really demands precision from line to line, because you have little you have a lot to work with, but also at the same time, very little to work with, right? I mean, if you decide to make a poem that's titled Untitled, the issue that is you're being given this space automatically. It's granted to you, right? You're allowed a title, right? That's one of the norms, right? That's one of the ways that culturally and also just how the human brain processes things. Like you are allowed a title. So if you tell yourself, I'm going to systematically never title my poems, you are giving up, right, a unit of meaning, right? You're leaving something on the table, which might not be advisable if you have a sort of additive view of greatness. If you're working, right, and you come to the end of a line and you decide, okay, I want my line break here, I want the next line break there, you're doing, things with enjambment. If you decide to not work with enjambment and just break your lines willy-nilly, that is another problem because you're leaving units of meaning, units of technical virtuosity and other things on the table needlessly, simply. And the only reason that you could give is like, what, you're lazy, you don't want to do it, like it's too hard, right? It's not so much that I think that art innately has a purpose, because it cannot. I agree with Nietzsche in that sense, and I agree that there's a lot of freedom that's afforded in that fact, but we should not downplay how things tend to really accumulate and go, of their own accord, right? I feel like there's this kind of like snowball acceleration that happens again and again in so many things in life. And because art is not divorced from the fabric of reality, right? Since that's not the case,
it's very true. It reminds me of something I was saying in a video recently, actually, very, very closely, where I was saying that, art is not something separate from reality, it's something in reality. And the level to which kind of concepts can create, and the level at which concepts become tendencies, or tendencies seem to form their own concepts, the way in which, what one thinks of Marshall McLuhan, and I think in a way, sort of Marshall McLuhan is sort of no one really talks about him anymore, but I think there's some real kind of
I'm not familiar with his ideas. Like what core idea, if you could just summarize that?
Well, for instance, his most famous saying is, the medium is the message. The ways in which sort of the mediums transform our lives in these bigger ways. They're the bigger context. They're the message. In the sense that all the stuff that appears on TV. Well, but we talk about all the stuff that appears on TV, but we don't. If you look out your window at night, you see the empty streets that are a consequence of the TV. You talk about the cars, but we don't talk about the endless road snakes of tarmac going around the planet. Where entire portions of cities are just given over to roads. The ways in which these things change our lives, that they have an almost autonomic tendency.
Yeah. I love that word. I always use that word, autonomic, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And the way that cars almost want you to build more roads, televisions desire more TV art galleries need paintings, and do you know what I mean? The places like auction houses like Sotheby's need stuff to be rolling in to cap those price records, what have you. These become system loops, feedback loops, like autocatalytic, if you will, feedback loops. And this is what capital is. Capital is a massive self-perpetuating positive feedback circuit in a sense. And I think the ways in which kind of one can be abstractly practicing various things like capital, unknowingly, in which this becomes almost like capitalist realism here, where we're talking about capitalism being almost this all-pervasive force that we are the puppets of. But these days in a modern society, in a techno-commercial, techno-capital world, most of the time, if we do anything well and anything to a surplus, with a kind of surplus of production, capital comes in through the back door. It's hard to do anything kind of well and not having it turn into a sort of enterprise. It's sort of, Mao has a Land talks about this, but Mao has this metaphor where he talks about capital being like mushrooms. you know, kind of like they just keep popping up. The amount of aggression you need, the amount you have to aggress against capital just to have it come in, which is weird now. When we again think about kind of like we were talking about intentionality to do, and politics and purpose and what have you. Well, you know, in a slightly rhetorical way, in my videos, I talk about, well, what does the art want? If only a kind of a rhetorical sort of turning around of the humanist argument of, you know, how can art service this or that humanist project? You know, well, what if we just turn it round? You know, if rather kind of, you know, the art objects and what have you being, you know, paraphernalia, ideological paraphernalia. What if we are the incubators of these things? You know, what if trans-individually, interpersonally, kind of the art multiplies itself through us, that this thing art is almost like some, you know, this alien which invades our reality through the stuff of our reality, or like it's, you know, the Terminator, you know, Skynet travels back in time to write itself into the future. You know, art is just this feedback loop that we're stuck in. You know, it's like it's totally naturalized, but yet it needs to always be on the move, because somehow if it isn't, it stops, it dies. You know, it has to constantly be mutating, and it's a weird thing to think about, and it goes into the realms of speculative fiction, you know, almost fiction theory, you know, speculative fiction, because it seems kind of sci-fi-ish. But like, I think that it's an interesting way to think about those questions of insofar as they have to do with what we were talking about with purpose and sort of the purposive political intentions of the art, or its political teleology.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things, you know, perhaps that ought to be tackled. Maybe, you know, eventually if I do like a big book on like, you know, art criticism in general, as it applies like across the board, one of the things that really needs to be explored is this, you know, idea of, you know, how ethics can intersect with aesthetics, but in a way that's like not this like, you know, brain dead, you know, like the what was it? What was that classic essay by Shelley, a defense of poetry, like very, you know, just very kind of over the top moralizing. That's not what I'm talking about, but that's definitely like an underrated feature that needs to be explored more, needs to be explored seriously. Which I guess brings us to a transition to Clement Greenberg, and I don't mean to like I don't mean to edge the audience too much here, but before we even get to Greenberg, let's just like define, I guess, our like sense of aesthetics a little bit. And if like we see any differences between that and artistic criticism. I mean, I mentioned this before, but I don't view aesthetics and artistic criticism, artistic judgment to be one and the same. When I think of words like kitsch, to me, they are nothing more than aesthetic descriptions, which does not connotate quality or a lack of quality in art, right? It's not the same thing as an artistic judgment to me, although Greenberg does use it as a kind of de facto artistic judgment in his essay. So maybe if you have like a few words on that before we go into the essay.
On judgment?
Well, I mean, just about like what I said, like, do you view like aesthetics as separate from artistic judgment? Do you view that
personally? No. I mean, but I think this is just and you know, this I'm trying to be humble here, but it's I think it's more just a case of the way we think about the roles of these things, more really about the commercial roles of these guys, the critic and the artist. I think in a way, and I was just talking about this with Mark on my Against Nature podcast. I think, especially nowadays, you know, there are so many critics, and there's certainly a kind of academy kind of criticism that goes on, which really is just the proliferation of the same. And I think that this should be a word we bear in mind going forward into this conversation. The same. And like much of this stuff, the academies, the managers, the people, when they speak, no one learns. This stuff is just the same that goes on. I think good criticism, that's because that's what, I think you and I both believe that we're into like good art. So good criticism, good art, I think both involves creativity. I think very often there is a very thin line between the two, when, and good critics and good artists blur the lines themselves, where artists we've seen take on the critical perspective, they criticize the critic, or we've seen critics who've become quite creative. And also this thing, which I'm reminded of a quote from T.S. Eliot, where he said, sometimes the reader reads the poem, the reader, forgive me if I paraphrase here, but the poem the reader reads is a different poem than the one the poet has written. In fact, and this is really great, it may even be a better one. And I think that case in which sort of, criticism is a form of ekphrasis. It's not just you having a fucking opinion. You're putting your opinion into a form in a public way. And you're remaking the work. It's ekphrasis. And within that work, it's like we were talking about in our last conversation, in fact, that what happens when we paraphrase the art? You make it again. And in that remaking, you betray the art. So what happens? What opens up in the space between the artist's making and the critic's making or remaking? So what happens? Now, Diderot would do this, or this is why Diderot was so interesting. He had so many bad fucking opinions, but he gets what's happening kind of on the level of the critical ekphrasis, like how one actually has to form a criterion for the judgments one makes about the art. And we were talking about what the art approves of too. In another video, I was talking about this painting by David, the Death of Marat, where someone was saying that the painting was unsuccessful because it supposedly was trying to romanticize or valorize a very bad man. And I just thought this is kind of simple. This is too simple a way to think about what the art condones. When I look at the painting, I see a dramatic image. I see a space of complicated relationships, so between shadow and light, between between all sorts of things, and these things can lead one to a sophisticated relationship of all sorts of a sophisticated appreciation of all sorts of other relationships in one's life. I mean, it's very much the same elaborate mechanism that comes into play when you make judgments about art that you use when you make judgments about anything else. This is how art comes about. We couldn't have the arts unless we learned to in some way enjoy our physical senses, the very senses we use to gauge our environment and figure out whether we're safe or whether we're not safe, whether we can trust someone or believe someone. It's not a different process. It just becomes involved in a more elaborate thing that happens in the art. So and they both are, I think they both arise. One arises from the other. I think it's all about that the question of judgment and ethics and aesthetics. It's complicated, and while on the surface, they may seem benign ideas like beauty and what have you. Kind of when we talk about it, we do get into quagmires of kind of, but I don't think there's a practical philosophy for kind of what you can say is sort of a pure kind of creative sort of judgment, or a kind of a pure aesthetic judgment, because very often I think it's just the case that kind of the roles have been naturalized, and we very much think of the role of the critic as being of a second order nature, perfunctory, which is how it works commercially actually most of the time. The critic is somebody who provides the kind of seal, the seal of approval. What's hot, what's what's back, and what's on the scene. It's and those guys are malignant. Those guys aren't really critics. I would say it's dead labor, which is like what I think kitsch is. I understand your objection to kitsch, but I think sort of and Greenberg I think is the great sort of person who puts forth the most convincing argument for what kitsch might be in sort of our world, sort of our capitalist sort of society. He sees it as the Alexandrianism of modern culture. That's the term he puts it in. And the timelessness of kitsch, it represents paralyzed culture. It represents
timelessness in the sense that it keeps coming up again and again, but it had, you know, I guess its deepest
timelessness also in the sense
expression
that
recently.
it was pastoral, bucolic, and rustic
Okay.
as well. And these very much appeal, you know, people suddenly in the urban centers, you know, early industrial revolution, suddenly this becomes the fashion, that people in sort of industrial centres want to know about people living in the Highlands in Scotland. They want to know about people living in the Himalayas. These are exotic, interesting things. And yeah, but I think kitsch, first and foremost, is market research. It's there to exist. It exists to focus the consumer mind by pandering to consumer sensibilities. In Marxian terms, this is, you know, this could be called dead labor. But, you know, I think there is a big overlap between something like Greenbergian aesthetics and something like Schneiderian aesthetics, actually. I mean, it's not a pure formalism, but it's a very kind of robust kind of, I mean, you look at something like Avant-garde and Kitsch and modern painting. I believe that's what the essay is called, his other seminal essay. But like these are very sort of limber, muscular arguments, sort of formulations for kind of what a high culture means and what the stakes are, and the idea of the cliche, right? Because this is important to Greenberg. Like when he talks about kitsch, and it's really the revolutionary necessity, something from Trotsky, the revolutionary necessity to shirk off cliche and the same, a certain timelessness, a certain kind of, you know, anything that panders, yeah, something that meets you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to like, I guess, go through some of the, just like, I guess, chronologically a little bit through the essay for anyone that's not familiar with it. So Clement Greenberg is arguing that, so we have like the avant-garde, right? People that we'd now consider avant-garde, like, you know, Picasso, especially like back then, where he was writing in 1939. This is when the essay was published. So like looking back, Picasso had already achieved his fame. And the reason why he sees the avant-garde emerging, not just like in, you know, the 1900s when he was writing, but also like historically, right? When do we have these historical situations where the avant-garde emerges? And to him, it emerges specifically to kind of like keep culture, you know, chugging along, right? There's all these attacks on culture. There's always these like threats of decadence. And because eventually, you know, art always tends to, just like, you know, with anything, art tends to become academic. Art becomes formulaic. Right now we have, you know, like cookie cutter MFA type writing. You know, we had, you know, academic painting, which had its, you know, bad reputation centuries ago. And he sees the avant-garde as like the corrective to this.
Yeah.
And so as the avant-garde tries to correct for all these problems in the art world, at the same time, specific to the 18 and 1900s, we have an expansion of two things. He doesn't mention material conditions in general, but we definitely do have an expansion, right? As Steven Pinker would argue, of like material well-being. The average person in the 1900s is definitely doing better than the average person in the 1500s or the 1700s. We also have with it an expansion of literacy, right? And the two tend to go hand in hand. But as, you know, literacy expands and as perhaps people have a bit more leisure time or whatever, they also become a market, right, for capitalists to dump their goods on. One of these goods could be art objects, right? And art objects are in scare quotes because these art objects that's dumped on the masses is kitsch. And because the working class, let's say, doesn't have enough time to really study all the codes that go into something like a Picasso painting, they're going to be far more, especially at the beginning, ready to reject that and far more willing to embrace something like kitsch, which is just kind of, you know, it's very easy to enjoy. It's very easy to understand. So kitsch becomes something that the working class is flooded in, while the cultural elites get to enjoy their Picassos and get to enjoy, everything else that, is a kind of, a function of leisure.
This is Greenberg distancing himself to some extent from Trotsky, because Trotsky defines himself against Stalin, because Stalin believes that art should connect its aims with the aims of the revolutionary party, and if it didn't, it was bourgeois and counter-revolutionary, and you know what happens then. What Trotsky really believes that art should engage itself with indigenous and sort of nativist political struggles, but that it should seek its own self-definition. And this is what begins, as we were saying, sort of art for art's sake, modernism. Modernist art for art's sake, but the Greenbergian formalism counters the idea that progressive art has to do with personal indigenous traditions and sort of political struggles. It actually, it's hostile to that, which is what you're getting here, where it says, kind of, you shouldn't, it's stupid to try and basically, in his own terms, he said the unique and proper area of competence of each art coincided with all that was unique to the nature of its medium. So a painting shouldn't involve itself with any kind of reference to anything beyond the material and its assembly for content. So this idea of its necessity to deliberately connect its aims to kind of stuff outside and reference all this sort of stuff outside of itself, it becomes part of Greenberg's narrative for the painting seeking its own purity, defining its own self, which is in some sense a kind of a self-purifying, a kind of purging, a jettisoning of kind of reference and literary devices and what have you. This is where kind of Greenbergian formalism becomes abstractionism and turns into abstract expressionism. But it is his concept. You're right. In his essay, it's very much reliant on this myth of the avant-garde, which begins with Fauvism and ends basically when Hitler is elected chancellor. And you have this basically what Greenberg is saying. The revolutionary sort of imperative there is that, okay, we need a new avant-garde. There should, but what can it be about if it can't connect directly to, if it can't count on the revolution, So it has to define itself on its own terms, and that's a purism purging of stuff, and it very often turns into a kind of, other critics talking about Greenbergian formalism have used such terms as dramatic reductionism. So we get a kind of emptying out of stuff and an enlarging of stuff, and this becomes the logoistic, iconic Greenbergian modernist look and what have you. But again, this becomes the bête noire of modernist intellectual aesthetic theory, and very, towards the end of the 70s, is now completely off the table in sort of art schools and galleries, sort of very, only retrospectively wheeled out as celebrity pieces. No one really takes Greenberg seriously. He seems very old hat and opposed to conceptualism, which is, very much, it takes Greenberg as its foil, and basically tries to subvert and disown Greenbergianism. But that's kind of like my understanding of Greenberg. In a way, kind of like there's all sorts of overlaps, like again that I see with other critics today, but also kind of with my own sensibilities. I don't know. I mean, like, what was your takeaway from like avant-garde? I don't suppose you think that a term like kitsch is any more credible, but
well, I mean, there's just like just like I'm just starting from a different standpoint. So I just have a ton of issues with some of the framing, I guess, some of the language. First of all, he doesn't truly define kitsch, but to just like the way that he describes, I guess, in an ultimate form. He says kitsch, using for raw material the debased and academicized simulacra of genuine culture, welcomes and cultivates this insensibility. It is the source of its profits. Kitsch is mechanical and operates by formulas. Kitsch is vicarious experience and faked sensations. Kitsch changes according to style, but remains always the same. Kitsch is the epitome of all that is spurious in the life of our times. Kitsch pretends to demand nothing of its customers except their money, not even their time. And I mean, one of the examples that he uses again and again is so like we have like that Russian painter Ilya Repin,
Oh,
right?
yes.
And he uses that what was that painting? Uh, uh, it was like it was the reply of the Cossacks to like
Yeah.
some Turkish warlord or whatever, and
Yeah.
famously they had this kind of like a dirty letter that he sent when he asked for surrender. Um, and like so like on the one hand I can sort of understand where he's going with identifying these kinds of objects as kitsch, in the sense that I can imagine, a vast majority of people at any given time, especially let's say in the last century and a half or so, when Repin was doing these paintings, they would look at it, right? They would be able to enjoy it, and they'd be able to understand what is going on. Perhaps, in the most superficial sense, with these paintings and other like kitsch-like objects, they don't necessarily have to think all that hard. But since I view kitsch as an aesthetic category rather than something that's subject to artistic judgment, um, uh, for me, kitsch is not simply something that is easily enjoyed and easily understood, which seems to be the two conditions that he has for defining kitsch. For me, the defining feature of kitsch is not that, although it could be that. It's more so that there is this perception, right? There's this perception of being easily understood and being easily enjoyed. And this
Yeah.
can include objects that are actually complex, great works of art, and also objects that are, kitsch in the pejorative sense, right? That have nothing more to them. And since that's the way that, I mean, like, for example, like I recently picked up one of my favorite books, Charlotte's Web, picked up a copy of this. And just like in prepping for this conversation, I was like, can Charlotte's Web be considered kitsch by a large number of people, in the sense that they could easily enjoy it and easily understand it? The answer, of course, is yes, because it is a children's book, right? And even when adults read it, right, they can, understand the lessons to the extent that there's moral lessons. And so this is the way that the book ends, and right, and to me, this is like a perfect representation of kitsch in literature. As time went on, and the months and years came and went, he, meaning Wilbur the pig, he was never without friends. Fern did not come regularly to the barn anymore. She was growing up and was careful to avoid childish things, like sitting on a milk stool near a pig pen. But Charlotte's children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, year after year, lived in the doorway. Each spring, there were new little spiders hatching out to take the place of the old. Most of them sailed away on their balloons, but always two or three stayed and set up housekeeping in the doorway. Mr. Zuckerman took fine care of Wilbur all the rest of his days, and the pig was often visited by friends and admirers, for nobody ever forgot the year of his triumph and the miracle of the web. Life in the barn was very good. Night and day, winter and summer, spring and fall, dull days and bright days. It was the best place to be, thought Wilbur, this warm, delicious cellar, with the garrulous geese, the changing seasons, the heat of the sun, the passage of swallows, the nearness of rats, the sameness of sheep, the love of spiders, the smell of manure, and the glory of everything. Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. Although he loved her children and grandchildren dearly, none of the new spiders ever quite took her place in his heart. She was in a class by herself. It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. I mean, there are some poeticisms in this ending. The very last paragraph about Charlotte, it's very prosaic, right? But the poetry is kind of implied. It's condensed. It's based on, parallels. but this is very kitschy in the sense that, you know, it's a universally loved book. It's a book that adults can understand, kids can understand. And it fits the definition of kitsch under the definition that I provide, right? In terms of like perceptual habits, right? In terms of whether or not this could be mass reproduced, because it is mass reproduced. Perhaps it's a little bit out of vogue in 2021, but generally speaking, you know, it is one of the most mass produced books of the 20th century and perhaps even parts of the 21st. And you know, the kitsch, like as represented by Charlotte's Web, it can't be a pejorative, right? It's a description of what you can expect. It's a description of some of the emotions that you could feel. And but to me, the difference between a great work of art that is kitschy versus kitsch that is not great art is I will hold the work that is not great art at arm's length, right? Whereas this, like, I mean, you know, reading this, like I feel myself like choking up, right? It's very easy for me to cry these kinds of descriptions. Of course, this, you know, seems very crass, right? This is a kind of an exemplar of what kitsch is, right? You would start sort of tear jerking, but I mean, I'm thinking about this on another level. I'm thinking about the book structurally. I see its merits in a way that, you know, perhaps many readers wouldn't, but it's still kitsch, right? Under, you know, I think most definitions that you could find. I mean, like, do you have like a response to that? Like, what are your thoughts on that kind of framing?
Whether Charlotte's Web is kitsch or not?
Well, I mean, in general, like you could even switch out Charlotte's Web for something
No,
else if you prefer it.
convinced me. I think it's definitely kitsch.
Yeah, but do you consider it a great novel?
No, I mean, I like no, I mean it's all right. I mean, like,
Oh, that's where we disagree. It's a great work of art, just flat out. Maybe I should do like an essay on this.
I'll tell you what I remember of I'll tell you what I remember about Charlotte's Web.
Read it as an adult. See if you see any differences.
I remember
Perhaps you
reading
do.
it and going like, good God, like this pig really enjoys slop. You know, it's written here. Yeah, it's a good book, but it's, you know, I think, you know, are you saying like children's literature is an interesting one, and you talk about kind of sort of welling up like with the animals and stuff, like, yeah, I mean, like, listen, I mean, if you want to stick on Marley and me, I'll probably well up like that too. I mean, I'm a big animal lover too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, but it's and you know, like sometimes on YouTube I'll go down these horrible rabbit holes where I'm just constantly watching videos of cute animals and people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like putting subtitles for animals. It's terrible, but what can I say? I'm human. But this is the point, you know. I mean, like, I can, like, it's, you know, this sort of stuff. I don't know, like I'm trying to kind of like come up with like the right counter argument here to like what I think is a kind of a kind of slightly inconspicuous error that I think a lot of people make when they talk about kitsch. You know, it's not that like kitsch is kind of like it that I think kind of when it comes to how well something is wrought and how well something is done, it's very easy to look at kitsch a lot of the time and see touches and marks that, you know, the signs of craftsmanship and such. And I think definitely like when you were reading Charlotte's Web, I was having flashbacks to reading it when I was in school, and the vivid descriptions of just, again, the pig eating the slop and like how tasty the slop is described. And how you can, like, even though it's slop, like you get how wonderful this is for the pig, and how the pig, you know, this is its life and it revels in kind of the detritus, and this is like brilliant. But you know, it's, I think that like if you just compare something like Charlotte's Web to so I don't think there's anything that's really kind of subversive or like really capital A artistic going on in something like Charlotte's Web. I think, you know, I mean, I don't know. I just think you've made a really good argument for it being kitsch. And again, like, killing kitsch doesn't preclude it from being enjoyable and from it being good. I mean,
well, that's supposed to be one of the defining features. Yeah.
Works. You know, kitsch works because we like it, because it works for us, but then the whole that's kind of not what kind of formalist aesthetics and kitsch is really trying to get at. Like kitsch, like real creativity, real art within kind of Greenbergian aesthetics is something akin to what early Russian formalists called estrangement or kind of astronomy. Kind of the idea of the art is that kind of it's, you know, because again, this is all coming out of Marx and Hegel and stuff, that kind of like art has kind of this future, this kind of horizon it goes towards. Kind of art constructs itself through history. It constructs itself through historical time. So there's a kind of so like formalism from a Greenbergian standpoint does have a kind of end of history. So it has a kind of like imperative, a sort of a revolutionary imperative to kind of undergo these transformations and resist the same. Not only because the same is kind of sort of paralyzes art, it isn't natal to art the way he thinks of it, but it's a culture of the same that is designed to amplify the same. And that, you know, it becomes, the same gets louder and louder and more persistent. And kind of the goal of art, it's search to find itself and to make aesthetic experience an end in of itself, is to get it more in kilter with kind of everyday life, paradoxically, kind of by opening up art in terms of not what it encourages or represents, but simply in what it's formed of. This somehow kind of makes its way into our life. I mean, this is like formalist sort of aesthetics going back to Cézanne, where process is content, where it's not about what the art kind of is, but how it's kind of, but this kind of thing isn't some sort of dry, arid game that formalists are playing, where kind of, you know, like kids in a sandbox. The idea is that they're playing with the building blocks of the medium. They're playing with the context of the medium itself, kind of the possibility. They become more attentive to the possibility of under which kind of these great works of art appear. So for like with kitsch, I think kitsch is you know, whatever kind of sort of goes into it, and there's an awful lot of like kitsch cinema, for instance, nowadays, and kitsch music that kind of has all sorts of charms and qualities, but is nonetheless kitsch. You know, and I think kind of does the business of kitsch, as it were, or autonomically. You know, it becomes part of that that feedback. I think art is like more of a like real like art. Okay, if we want to talk about authentic art, and I think authenticity is a precondition of our conversation, that like real art is something like a glitch in the system. It's something really like a glitch, some sort of aberration, something that really kind of is slightly unaccountable. And it's why it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, but the sort of almost the moral dubiousness of some great art in terms of what it proposes. I think, you know, there's some art that we can look at and we can recognize and go, oh, this is good. This is good art. You know, like, oh, it hits you. It's hitting all the right beats here. Okay, but at the end of the day, that art could still turn out to be kitsch. This is the double bind of kitsch in our culture, which is, you know, a kitsch culture. In fact, you know, kitsch is a result of capitalism, which is a result of modernity. It's a problem that kind of art has to face, in a way it's a problem we have to face, and it's not so clear as kind of like kitsch is pictures of velvet clowns, or kitsch novels about BDSM vampires. Yeah, it's much more. There's a lot of hard work to do, as someone like Gadamer would put it, in the realm of aesthetics. But that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, and it doesn't mean kitsch is some just fugitive, flimsy red herring, I think.
Well, let me try another tack, and then we can move on to like the next part of the essay. Do you accept, just conceptually, the possibility that there could be a great work of art that is a children's novel?
Yeah, I accept the possibility of that, yeah.
And assuming that this possibility transpires, wouldn't by definition that great children's book, which is optimized for A, enjoyment, and B, you know, universal understanding, immediate understanding perhaps, at least in its more superficial levels, wouldn't you agree then that that great work of art meant for children is also by definition kitsch?
That's when things get weird, certainly. And we can talk about great paintings or masterpieces which become implicated in a kind of kitsch culture, by no fault of their own, in a sense. But for instance,
well, you would only use the word fault if kitsch is pejorative from the get-go, but you don't have to view it that way. You know what I mean? That's basically what I'm getting at.
I understand, but if you'll bear with me, it's like like the way that great paintings turn up on the side of biscuit tins or cookie tins or what have you, on postcards, or even kind of you see them on the side of you get like Monet sunflower, like Louis Vuitton handbags. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so yeah, it becomes weird at the level in which kind of, we live in an age of mechanical reproduction, and that mechanical reproduction gets very strange when we have representations of representations. And then I mean, these paintings, which are, we get pictures of them, and the pictures become kind of iconic because they become like memes. I think this is a word that is quite new, but this idea of the meme is very prevalent, very crucial, I think, to modernism. In sort of Nietzsche and his peers would have thought of it as hyperstition, but that for us it's memes. It's these, almost like we were saying, autonomics, kind of like these things which become tendencies, which blow up. These ideas which have no owner, these pictures which have copies, which have no original. Suddenly, art gets put in this weird zone now where it has to deal with this world of mirrors, and it's like funhouse mirrors. And again, where everything is displaced into the market, and where kitsch moves to involve everything intensively. This is the thing about kitsch. It's an intensive movement that it seeks to draw more in, while recommiserating it to its standards. It's never a full absorption of the other, the ulterior. It's always a totally, it totally becomes it totally works within the values of kind of those market values, within those commodity values or whatever. And there's no escape, there's no exit in a way. This is the dilemma of capitalist realism and what have you, kind of like, how does one extricate oneself from this whole business of, I mean, not just the institute, but capital, when it's so pervasive. I mean, it might not be such a big deal for you or for any art person listening to this, or for practicing artists even. I mean, it's certainly de rigueur for people to think about art as a kind of business, as a kind of art nowadays, especially in our entrepreneur-centric culture we live in now. But was there more to get to in the essay?
Yeah, well, just well, you touched on the kind of like capitalist elements that are kind of inherent in the essay as well. So one of the things also that I have a problem with here is just the fact that like a lot of Marxist analysis. Here's like the irony to me, like Marxism is supposed to it's supposed to theoretically turn Hegel on his head. It's supposed to invert, Hegelian idealism into like actual materialism. But I noticed just like
historical materialism into dialectical materialism.
Well, Hegel's more kind of idealistic notion. Like, what was the quote that he said? Something like that it's really like consciousness, right? That creates
historical consciousness.
Yeah, that creates the world. Whereas like Marx would say, or like Sartre would say, like existence precedes essence, right? So. And I just noticed, like in general, this tendency among Marxists, and I mean, it's not unsurprising, but it's there, where they very much become idealists somewhat unknowingly, right? Somewhat unwittingly. And one of the ways that I'm seeing this come out in this essay is, so he sees, the avant-garde as this kind of, elitist reaction to academic art, right? People that are within a leisure class, people that are able to, either do the art, or B, have enough education to decode some of the elements in this art to actually appreciate it. Right, the avant-garde is there for that purpose, and kitsch is what's force-fed to everybody else.
Yeah, he's definitely doubling down on the idea of an elite almost aristocratic idea of a high culture in opposition to a
Yeah. And to me, there's this kind of like very severe idealism throughout this critique because, within it is this implication that if you were to have, some sort of Marxist style equality, or perhaps not even equality, but just make things more equal than they are, under another system, you're going to have more people that are kind of compliant, right, with the avant-garde, right? They're going to be more willing to accept this art as art. They're going to be more willing to, or rather even have, the time and the wherewithal, the leisure to understand art. And to, when Picasso first came out, now it doesn't seem very revolutionary, but when Picasso first came out, they would be among, the groups of people that are first to kind of embrace Picasso. And, I'm not so sure that's true, because for the same reason that I don't necessarily trust this idea that, the elites have the leisure to decode Picasso and therefore they decode Picasso and accept them and everybody else rejects them. To me, I just view the art world and artistic judgment and a lot of like similar stuff and like cultural stuff that we have going on, mainstream liberalism today or whatever, a lot of it is just kind of identity games, right? So if you could wrap up you mentioned radical chic, like, well, Picasso could be radical chic to a bunch of capitalists, right? They don't have to have any real understanding of this kind of stuff. In fact, the more that we see like wealthy people now that cultivate platforms, like people like, Eric Weinstein, coming out of fucking nowhere, right? Manager of like, Teal Capital. And now he's become this kind of cultural mainstay. When he talks though, despite being rich, despite being hyper educated with a PhD, for the most part, he has no idea what he's talking about. And most people involved in culture at any kind of juncture, whether it's lower class, upper class, they're probably in the same category, right? They're not going to like, most of these people would not be able to explain Picasso any better than a working class person who's reacting negatively to it, not because there is anything innately negative necessarily to react, although I think there's some of that perhaps. They're probably reacting negatively because they see these pampered elites that they already hate forging an identity around this. Why do so many working class people instinctively recoil at like, this idea of like trans rights or whatever else? It's probably because they see elites embracing it and they're like, are you trying to like, come after me in some way? Or are you trying to like turn me gay, turn me trans, or like whatever that people say? I don't think that with more leisure time and more like material well-being, I don't think most people would necessarily become connoisseurs, or even I think perhaps like a greater percentage of them can cultivate a deeper understanding about things. Obviously, the function of like time and money, like you get to do those sort of things fine. But I think in general, the average person is going to be what happens in office space. I think office space is the kind of like mainstream reality where somebody comes, let's say they suddenly have like a few $100,000 or millions of dollars or whatever. They will do what that protagonist does, which is like, oh, what I want to do now, since I get to live the American dream, is I want to wake up and I want to do nothing, right? And that's like one of the underrated qualities of Office Space. It's like this guy that finally gets what he wanted, which is money. Like, what does he do with it now? And his answer is nothing. I think that's probably true of most people. I don't think the elites have necessarily a greater kind of insight into something like the arts, right, compared to anybody else. And I mean, eventually, it's kind of a cliche at this point, right, that the avant-garde becomes kind of like the old guard, right? Picasso is now, honestly, like if you want to be like a working class person and you want to sort of virtue signal that you actually have depth to you in some way, you're going to hang a Picasso right on your wall. You're not going to hang, like something like, that painting of like the dogs playing poker or whatever, right? You're going to hang a Picasso. You're going to hang a Caravaggio. You're going to say, look at me, I understand this kind of shit.
Yeah, but Greenberg is writing this in a very different time to you. And Picasso is a very different Picasso isn't quite that figure he is yet.
Yeah, he's not there yet.
But Picasso isn't quite this figure he is now. I think it's not always. I mean, certainly the revolutionary class and sort of the actual Communist Party didn't accept Picasso, and they saw him as too bourgeois. Mm-hmm. And and it's also very much the case that many people, many high society people, didn't take with Picasso because he was also too revolutionary. That was kind of his sort of paradoxical thing. I mean, there are very few people like Picasso in that sense. But I mean, you're also talking about the cult of modernism, which is something that's come about in the last 30, 40 years, where these sort of high modernists have become a kind of, a brand. You put the posters on your wall. Is that hell? You can buy posters of Matisse at IKEA, and we have these Renault Picassos or whatever with Picasso's signature on them. Yeah, so like in the interim, these artists, their myths have been turned into a whole iconography, which is a big thing in kitsch and a big thing in sort of societies and of control and what have you, that there are iconographies, that there are these things. I mean, it's become just another big sort of story that we all are sold and that we all buy into. There are kitsch versions of these artists' lives. There are sort of Hallmark daytime sort of biopic versions of the life of Matisse or the life of Picasso. There have been 7 million films about the life of Van Gogh and songs and covers by Ed Sheeran. So art. This is something is a lifestyle. The artist thing is a lifestyle. But this is important to know. These things change all the time, throughout history, sort of successively. I mean, what it meant to be an artist, to be a bohemian in sort of early modernism, is something very different than to be a bohemian nowadays in sort of 2021. I think the thing that Greenberg is doing here is like, you have to, I think, put it in the spirit of the zeitgeist too. I think. I mean, I keep saying like the larger context, but this is the larger context. You've read Vonnegut, right? Have you read Bluebeard?
No, I mean I have, but I haven't read it.
But you know kind of the spirit of Vonnegut. The spirit of Vonnegut is one of profound pessimism, and this is saturated. I mean, he likes the abstract expressionists, and he feels a kinship with the abstract expressionists. He's a survivor in a way. He's a veteran of the war, he's seen things in the war, and he has this weird guilt and this paranoia about it. And it's the same kind of existential Sartrean horror as well that pervades Greenbergian sort of modernism at the time too. The Nazis basically won, or the Nazis by another name won. Yes, the concentration camps and what, but what about Dresden? The Florence of the North, firebombed, everyone in it killed, or the concentration camps in Kenya, or all the shit that Churchill did. I mean, basically, the winners wrote the history books. I mean, but things just changed and everyone forgot. And that's the horror of Vonnegut. Actually, the baddies won, but everyone was everyone was bad, everyone was evil. But now we live in this world which is the result of that. You watched Satan's Brew the other night. I believe you told me kind of that's the theme there, where kind of it's like it's a world of kind of where it's almost like the bourgeois world. It kind of represents evil values in a certain fucked up way. It's this sort of moment of profound existential dread. I think when someone like Willem de Kooning makes a big expressionistic painting in 1957, if someone were to make a big expressionistic painting today, a normal everyday working person you pull off the street would have no trouble looking at that, I think, and going, oh yeah, wow, that's really emotional and really, they just painted and they just felt it. They would find that really believable, Alex. Yeah. Normal, everyday working schmucks who know nothing about art would find that, they find that normal, to think that there's something expressive and emotional and subjective in that stuff. People in the 1950s flat out rejected the concept entirely. that there might be something beautiful about what Willem de Kooning was doing, or what Rothko was doing, or what Pollock was doing. But really what it was a demonstration of the impossibility of any kind of sincere feeling whatsoever. That's how they looked at it. So it was almost like a kind of big shimmering void. That was their idea of the future of art. And this isn't something I necessarily agree with. I'm trying, but I find it fascinating.
What being the future of art? What exactly?
A big shimmering, indeterminate, murky void of in a way, what's represented in kind of, you know, the work of Rothko and Pollock and de Kooning and Klein,
Okay.
and Clifford Still, and later Colorfield, people like Frankenthaler. It's pure, the idea of a pure poetry or pure art for art's sake. That was what they thought was the answer, but they didn't feel it had anything to do with, in a way, it was just a kind of, it's very odd. But then that was the cultural zeitgeist at the time. That was the era of the atomic bomb, you know, and of Sartre and what have you. And now, but nowadays, kind of again, kind of our public perceptions have shifted. The ways that we think about art has shifted, and what's commercially viable and commercially, you know, believable has shifted. You know, like it was the case that kind of like when Picasso first made Les Dames et d'Avignon, his big you know, first Cubist painting, people didn't take it seriously. They thought it looked like it looked more like the cartoons that were in the newspapers at the time, making fun of modernist paintings. Mm-hmm. People like the artist Winsor McKay, you know, Little Nemo and Slumberland, would always do like these parody comics of kind of like Cubist express. That's what it looks like to them. And it's just, things shift all the time. It's tricky. It's change occurs all the time in the art, and I think like that's the thing, kind of like critique and also kind of making has to take into account the possibility for change within the art and transform. But then that's the part of the resisting the same, resisting what could be seen, what you could rephrase as cliche. And the Dan's formulation of cliche, as I remember it, it is, what is a cliche? It's a familiar thing used in a familiar way to a familiar effect. Mm-hmm. Am I off the track there?
I mean, it would have to be all three, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit, I mean, that doesn't sound a million miles away from what kind of Greenberg is sort of there. And again, when Dan says kind of like art has to resist cliche, I mean, what's he saying there? I mean, kind of, isn't there a teleology there? Kind of like the art has its own kind of, art is seeking its own kind of freedom, or its own, or it's trying to define itself, or it's in a period of consolidation. I believe this in a sense. This is where I see kind of this nexus of ideas happening between people like you, people like Dan, people like Greenberg, and all this other stuff. But I think there are like differences in sort of language and how we think and we approach kind of these mediums or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with some of that framing. It's just that, well, I mean, my critique of Greenberg here, you know, it's more kind of generalized, first of all, in the sense that, again, like I doubt that even among the elites that were accepting Picasso at the time, or even around the time that Greenberg was writing, right? Because there was a transition, right? By the time that 1939 rolls around, Picasso was accepted, right? That is now more or less a kind of like old guard, right? Mm-hmm. But the point that I'm making is
this is what keeps things moving, though. Surely the fact that the high stuff always trails off into a kind of mannerism.
Yeah, sure. There's no issue with that, but it's more so that, you know, the people championing it, I don't necessarily accept that you know, like his framing is one of, you know, it's kind of elitist in the sense where, you know, it's these codes, it's these codes that have to be decoded. And yet to me, like you know, when I look at like criticism historically, when I look at various art movements, when I look at just shit that people say today versus then, like at any given time, you know, people are just talking a whole lot of fucking shit that has to do much more with their personal identities, with where they wish to place themselves psychologically, and not necessarily, you know, reflective of their understanding of anything deeper. So, you know, that's part of the critique, right? This kind of like this weird Marxist idealism, I don't really accept. And I don't accept that, you know, the granting of leisure time and even the granting of education will turn people into, you know, perhaps in a baseline way. Of course, they will understand more, but for some of these, you know, like topics like art, you know, it's hard to say. Like, I think the best case scenario is if we have something valuable to say about the arts and it could like rub off on people, you know, that's really useful.
Something that Benjamin would say, and Benjamin had a lot of Marxian thinking. I mean, I think you can have like Marxian thoughts, but not be a Marxist per se. I mean,
I think I'm the same way. Yeah,
is that art is educative in that sense, in that you know, and or he says that art does educate, but not in the sense of a kind of political, in what it politically condones or on what have you. I think it's tricky, but like, you know, I think, I mean, I very much am kind of an elitist. I would say, kind of personally, but kind of it's a tricky thing. I mean, I don't really believe in kind of equality of outcomes. And there's a kind of like, I guess, like a Hobbesian streak in me where, like, I mean, and you were alluding to kind of this competitive thing, like this.
Yeah, I'm not against elitism in that sense. I'm saying that his elitist critique is one of, there is all this stuff to be decoded and the elites are progressively doing it, which is why they accept Picasso. I don't accept that chronology. I think they're just reacting to their personal tastes, likes, dislikes, their identity structures. Oh my God, I could be part of this radical chic, so let me accept this new guy on the block. I think that's really what it always is most of the time, basically.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly you're right in the sense that kind of Greenberg does promote the idea of a historical consciousness of painting, an enlightened historical consciousness of painting, and like you know, it does come off in this. I mean, Patrick Heron too. There's this aristocratic sort of elitist sort of quality to it. I mean, but I don't think the problems necessarily that Greenberg is suffering from here are kind of all together to do with Marx, really. I mean, the kind of things you're talking about are really kind of ones of sort of like Kant, really, and it's Kant who Greenberg will return to in a big way later in his career. I mean, like, and you know, he contradicts himself essay to essay, man. This is the thing. You know, we're picking through this essay, but Kant, you know, is that legislative thing where, you know, he is trying to sort of basically create kind of like the rules that will correct art and get it all into this intelligible shape where we can say kind of, you know, what's what, and you know, there's the kitsch and there's art, and the art that doesn't embrace kind of embrace kind of the Greenbergian highway was sort of destined to go the way of the dinosaurs. There's like this Darwinian sort of element to it, but I think this is tricky, and certainly, you know, I mean, it's I mean, it's funny as well because so much of, again, like I was saying, like mid-century modernist sort of like, I mean, God, pop art and conceptualism is so hostile to Greenberg, and he's setting out to disprove all this stuff that you're talking about, and you know, it's a whole, that becomes the whole intellectual chic of the time, actually. And I mean Greenberg is not, this is the thing, kind of Greenberg's kind of chicness, and trendiness is not on the table right now. And like, even in his time, it's like, for the time it was chic, it built up a lot of cultural resentment with people as being this cultural imperialism. Who the fuck are you going around saying that you represent the high kind of culture, and you're the arbiters of XYZ, and this is kitsch, but like, who do you think you are, fucking and cultural imperialism, right? And this is in a way the legacy of Greenberg now in art schools. I mean, if you mention Greenberg to like one of my teachers, like David Albertson, he was like, give you a look like this. Like, yeah, do you know what I mean? Like, but I think there is something now somehow subversive today to say, like, to believe in the idea of some kind of like eclectic culture. I mean, the idea that like when an artist speaks or when a critic speaks, that, you know, there might only be a select few of the people who understand you.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something I think that kind of,
and that's not really going to change though. And I mean, we should, you know, like whatever, you know, it is what it is.
And the desire to cover all bases, kind of, that's the thing one should be kind of suspicious of, because that's really what the tendency of everything is right now these days, to like, you know, collapsing sort of web-like systems of sort of meeting consumer demands, meeting people's like. But so with Greenberg, it's the interest in sort of the idea of shall we say, a kind of that art had a destiny of to kind of define itself, and to and that, but that this would happen in historical time. This whole thing in a sort of, by a way of a Nietzschean way, this thing was happening in a big way over time, and that this was the real sort of transcendental thing, unlike Kantian reason, that this whole kind of process is bigger than kind of you and I, and it's really about finding those kind of interstitial things that will kind of those strange desolatory sort of unexplored spaces that will expedite or accelerate the process into some kind of new zone. Like, again, like it's a pretty straightforward teleology, and it does sound idealistic, but the whole appeal of it, again, is the thing that sort of puts it at odds with our moment right now, like how it seems to go beyond indigenous and nativist sort of strains and all that sort of stuff. It seems to go beyond identity politics in a way. It seems to go beyond, you know, the idea of sort of political fashions, but I mean, it doesn't totally get outside the whole problems of, you know, commerce and the gallery space and what have you. But it's something that I think is sort of actually bound to come back more and more into aesthetic fashion. I think people more and more are sort of I think more and more there is an interest in a kind of a pure formalism, as opposed to kind of the pseudo formalism we get so much online. I think people know that's not enough for critique. I think people know that goes nowhere. I think, I mean, this is the problem I think that you and I both have with kind of like internet critique and bullshit like that. It is just the same for the same's own sake. That's not fucking critique. That's not fucking anything. You know, even if, like, you know, it's got all the right dotted I's and crossed T's, you know, it's something, you know, again, dead labor.
And you know, touching on this formalism, one thing that I think is very useful in Greenberg is, I came across this idea actually this morning, when he talks about like medium specificity, right? Because you know, and that also gels very nicely with my own kind of, you know, artistic ideas, because, you know, he would say something like, if you have, you know, a medium such as oil painting, well, there's specific advantages there. Perhaps there are also some disadvantages. You have to work with that reality, right? It's going to be different than with watercolors. They have their own advantages and disadvantages. If you're writing a poem, and you know that historically and culturally and as a fact, you have an option to do a title and you refuse that, well, you are kind of, you know, neglecting a portion of the medium, right? You are neglecting an advantage for whatever reason, unless you have a very good reason for doing that. That's not to say that you can't have a poem without a title. I mean, you can, right? And it could even work, right? You could even have a good reason for that, right? An artistically justifiable reason. But generally speaking, you know, whatever a medium offers to you, there's a reason why, right? You're going to do that medium. There's a reason why you would do like a great animation versus a great film. It would be very fucking weird to do an anime that, you know, that has the chronology of like Woody Allen's Another Woman, right? Or like most Bergman films. It's just like, if you're going to do some sort of high drama, you know, perhaps anime is not the best for it.
Think of it in painterly terms, a Salvador Dali painting done in a Cézannean style. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just doesn't
work.
work.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? It's So, I mean, you get a very clear idea about what kind of the Greenbergian aesthetic is and why it's called informally abstractionism, you know, and like you were saying, kind of the sort of the essentialism of the materials and sort of how they should accentuate the surface and the shape of the stretched canvas, and how it move away from representation towards the flatness, how that's what the spectator sees first, abandoning a sort of Renaissance illusionism. I think, I mean, in retrospect, certainly some of his ideas about pictorialism seem kind of silly, but again, like in his moment, like it seemed all quite logical and straightforward. You know, that he thinks that kind of flatness is what painting's all about. He thinks he looks selectively at the history of art, and he thinks, well, there's a move towards surface and flatness. So painting is really going to become more and more flat, kind of the more and more modern it becomes, as the purer it becomes, it will become more and more kind of flat surfaces. And that's how you get color field painting, like people like Morris Louis or Frankenthaler, where just the color is just these huge canvases spread in such huge areas that the power almost dissipates. They're like these huge kind of very, very odd things. I mean, I have arguments with painters all the time about the merits of this movement or that school of painting. It's, you know, it's endless. No one ever fucking agrees. But he really did believe that this was the move forward. I mean, and again, in retrospect, again, this seems like, you know, a bias, like you're saying, like an aesthetic preference on his part. So like, so he, because, you know, I mean, because, oh God, I mean, just look at the people who the neo-avant-garde, which sort of begins right at the end of the abstract expressionist movement, with someone like Frank Stella, who is making these paintings that are, it's kind of like they're kind of Schweikian. They obey all Greenbergian modernist precepts. They emphasize surface, flatness, shape of the canvas, but they don't actually deliver on any of the effects. They don't actually function the way these paintings are supposed to. They don't even look like paintings most of the time. So there's this weird sort of like hostility, sort of disguised as do you know what I mean? Kind of this non-compliance that happening with all these games where people are riffing on Greenbergianism and what have you, or Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns making paintings that were technically Greenbergian that incorporated imagery, iconography, consumer culture detritus, quirkiness, you know, all this other stuff. But technically they followed all the rules of, you know, the surface, the shapes that were all emphasized. You know, it begins to short circuit Greenbergian, you know, precepts. You know, kind of begins to challenge and probe them. And yeah, that the rest is history. You know, but the whole thing that happens with the emergence of the neo-avant-garde is the derailing of the idea that the avant-garde can be resurrected a la Greenberg, that, you know, the role, you know, art can kind of seek out this purism that was started with Matisse and Cézanne and Picasso, and instead it's something else. It's postmodernism creeps up with them. So yeah, it's the sort of neo-modernism killed in its cradle.
Well, I think we covered enough of Greenberg. Do you want to talk about Satan's Brew? We
can finish off. I think that like we've talked for a while, but I think we can finish off talking about Satan's Brew, because I think that can line up with some of the stuff we were talking about nicely.
Yeah.
What are your impressions of it? Because I know it's a strange film.
Yeah. So you were talking about it with Dan Linden on the Leviathan podcast that you guys did, and so this Fassbinder film. I think I saw only one other Fassbinder film, but that was like maybe like over 10 years ago. I don't really remember. So I watched this a couple days ago, and I mean, I don't know. There were some moments I think they were humorous. I think like structurally there was some stuff that was interesting and other stuff that like didn't go far enough. Like early on, for example, when, you know, he kills the prostitute that he sees. with the gun, and he has like his is that his brother, or is that his
brother?
His brother, hide the gun. He hides it in a piece of furniture, and then suddenly these people show up later. Well, there's an interval of time that passes right before people come to repossess the furniture, and enough time passes, which is like a good writerly decision, right? Where enough time passes in the film where you forgot that the gun was hidden right in the furniture, but nothing really comes of it, right? They don't take out that piece of furniture. It's never really revisited, right? So there's no kind of like satisfaction to that kind of good early writerly choice, and that kind of the time that passes. I guess there's like some humor that's kind of funny. There was one scene where he's like calling for he's calling up like Germanic men, right? Where you start thinking like, okay, is there something like, possibly homosexual going on here, right? Later on, it's revealed that, he thinks that he's or rather, perhaps he's pretending that he's the reincarnation of the poet, Stefan George, so that he could, get away with plagiarism or whatever. And, in that scene where he's asking for the Germanic men, the interaction that he has with that woman, it really kind of like it says something about her psychology. It says something about her kind of perhaps strength of character, and there's this kind of like odd almost flirtation at the beginning, which I think was nicely done. But those kind of moments to me were very rare. I think most of it was just kind of very tiresome, not funny. The ending was kind of, it reminded me a little bit of Herzog's Port of Call, Bad Lieutenant film, where the ending is this kind of absurd thing where this cop that is just like out of control for the entire film is suddenly like all the bad shit that he gets into, it's reversed. He's now celebrated. He doesn't have to speak to any kind of consequences, and it's something that wouldn't probably happen in real life, but it has some real world implications in the sense that, well, it's true that most cops don't get away with this level of improper behavior, but generally cops do get away with a lot of improper behavior. And even if you can't find one that would get away with this level of misbehavior, as a force in general, they cumulatively get away with a whole lot of shit that they shouldn't get away with. That would be, far worse than the net effect of this one cop's behavior. But I don't see the same kind of, if you want to call it a lesson or an anti-lesson, whatever, I don't see the same kind of thing happening in Satan's Brew at the end. It's just this kind of over the top thing where this poet that seems to be a plagiarist and perhaps not even a good writer, who has like some celebrity and is broke, he gets all these women back on his side again, which, I could sort of understand what's being said, but it's also, just broadly speaking, it's not really a lesson, right? It's more of an anti-lesson. And, coming on the heels of everything that I just described, it just didn't gel for me in any kind of way. Maybe you could talk about the positives, like what would you do like to convince someone that it's actually worthwhile? How would you approach this kind of critique, or maybe even not approaching the critique? Like, how would you present the film?
Well, I didn't expect you to like it, to be perfectly honest, because, well, most people actually that I've talked to don't like it. It's peculiar and slightly embarrassing because I'm on my own on this respect. Even dedicated Fassbinder seems to not like it. But I really...
You said that Peter Cleese, you said that Peter Cleese thought it was a great film?
No, my friend Peter Stedman, that's a different
those are, okay.
But like, yeah, it's, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's certainly when you read the reviews as well, people seem to have the same problems that you have with it. That kind of, it generally feels a bit kind of aimless and a sort of inscrutable sense of humor and what have you. I can always say that, to me from the outset, this just seems like a surreal slapstick comedy. It's a situation comedy,
and it is. I mean, it is that, right?
It's best to think about it in terms of like a Monty Python film, really. But it's about an artist, a writer in sort of a creative crisis. We don't know actually whether he's good or not. We do see that he unknowingly perhaps plagiarizes Stefan Gierge, after which he has a crisis and sort of convinces himself somehow that he's the reincarnation of Stefan Gierge. It really is kind of like the archetypical it's like the stereotypical, archetypical story of like the German like writer, kind of like and Walter Kranz himself is almost like the perfect image of kind of the tormented, angst-ridden German author, even down to his haircut and even his life. It's like just a whole mix of different tropes and cliches from like German literature and what have you, and like he's got a fucking retarded brother who like tries to who plays with flies on the window all the time. Just such amazing lines, like he tries to fuck his flies without success so far, I'm sure, and his wife, who's kind of like sexually insatisfied and frumpy, and like but how he undergoes all these different sort of metamorphoses in this crisis. It's interesting. You know, there's
which metamorphoses? Because I think that's one of my main problems with the film. There's not really much that happens, I don't think, with the character. But if you see it, metamorphoses, like what?
Well, there's this sort of sense in which he's playing with sort of the idea of himself as a political artist. And there's certainly all this sense of kind of like, you know, the whole baggage of, you know, the shadow of National Socialism and the whole legacy of German history. And it's sort of, it's, you know, the whole kind of double bind, kind of, it's a post-war German art scene. But and I mean, that's everywhere, and like fascism is a big theme of the story, I think. But what were we talking about? Oh yeah, of his transformations. Yeah, well, he tries to turn himself into this kind of Nietzschean master of this woman, and kind of like sort of present himself as this sort of mysterious master. Other times he sort of toys with the idea of being a homosexual. There's the whole kind of weirdly stagey Grand Guignol scene where he sort of breaks into a woman's house and sort of like robs her, daylight robbery, kind of like, but she's turned on by it, and like it feels camp and surreal, and then like it goes away, and I mean, we can talk about the ending, but I think the whole thing is like a sort of bizarre, slightly surreal, kind of like almost like story about like a Faustian German literary figure kind of in our modern age. I mean, there's a press release by
what is the bargain that he makes though in that kind of analogy? Like what do you think happens there?
Well, let me read this press release that Fassbinder wrote for the film, which he wrote for like the just like this small pamphlet. He said, because this is revealing, he said, Walter Kranz is a man who comes from the petty bourgeoisie, we know this from the film, who has had success through literature and in the course of time became politically active, whether out of sincerity or whether he joined because it was fashionable. And now he takes a step. He returns to the middle class model of mode of behavior, even if the middle class has become fascist. This seems quite logical to me. How can a man like Kranz, an artist, live in any other way except the one society prescribes for him? And the way he lives is completely normal, but taken to the extreme. So really, it's a bizarre situation comedy about, you know, the artist, but it's a kind of heightened, like almost like Artaud is quoted at the beginning of it. It's like this strange kind of frothing at the mouth kind of film where kind of it kind of lays this sort of thing bare, kind of where the artist is kind of schizoid. He's living in this world which is kind of trying to naturalize and tame him. And there's the whole, it creates a culture of masochism, expectation of diminishing returns, self-doubt and what have you. This is what, you know, we see all this play out on the screen in front of us with like, and we see like how, you know, I think sex is, and like, you know, relations and the whole idea of sort of, you know, the masculine sort of artist, but also the middle class artist, the bourgeois artist, the avant-garde artist, the political artist, the queer artist, the these all become the kind of the costumes that he desperately tries on like a drag act, and none of them fit. And then at the end, kind of what you're left with is something quite odd and like kind of like a weird pantomime. All the characters who are dead leap up off the floor and start laughing. And it's the weirdness, it's the kind of surrealness of like hearing a laugh in the next room, but it's a soundtrack on the TV. All you've been watching is kind of, it is very curious, and it's a very weird kind of note to end the film on, but I mean appropriate in light of the references to Artaud. But I mean, although not as surreal, of course, it owes a lot to Brecht, obviously, but also I think to I think because recently I've been writing, and Fassbinder's Satan's Brew has been on my mind, and like especially like the scenes where like he turns around to like his wife and his brother, and he's like he reads them poetry, and he's like and he's like, what did he say? He's like a cheer, applaud, and they sort of squawk him like parrots. There's like all this other times, like in the film, where people kind of squawk or shriek at one another, kind of money, kind of like like out, like it's like kind of a weird, very, very weird kind of primitive kind of thing, like of film, but it has this. I think it does have like funny insights too. It's not just a kind of
I think there's some. Remember, like near the end, where like the fan that he meets, that he tries to sort of like take as a kind of mistress. At the end, when she rejects him, right, and she's like, "Oh, you're weak. You're just like me, right?" And then she says something like, like, and to think that someone like me, could be deceived by someone like you, right? Where she's kind of, inflating herself, just like he's been inflating himself. And you as the viewer know that both of them are just delusional, right? In terms of like their own self-worth, right? Not their self-worth, but in terms of
he's a masochist. He's a masochist, and she's a masochist too.
But in terms of like the worth that society would naturally give them, you notice that, for example, like in some like Woody Allen movies, like oftentimes like Woody would like he would try to make a woman into like like if he tries to make her like really like sexually undesirable, he gives her certain qualities and makes her kind of like extra nerdy. And I feel like she got the same kind of qualities, but also on another level, like you read that description, that press release that Fassbinder released, and he characterizes all this as a man, being normal perhaps is normal, but can't sort of is not allowed to express his true normalcy. Well, to me, when I was watching it, I think it's kind of the opposite, right? Not only is there a lack of normalcy, but if you contrast it with a film like Scorsese's After Hours, it's not that you have necessarily the same kind of absurdist situation. It's also an absurdist situation in After Hours, where it's much more so like a Kafka-esque absurdist situation.
Yeah.
And the reason why that film works on different levels, like you could even take a girl on a date to watch that film, because it works even on that level, because especially early on, you have characters that are kind of like sitting around with each other, and they're clearly flirting. The flirting is well written. You see lots of, on the one hand, sexual tension, which means that, and the reason why it's tension is it could go one way or it could break the other direction, right? And you're starting to root for this character, the protagonist, who is also not even necessarily all that likable, because as these situations unfold, you see him like he clearly wants to have sex with like the different women that he comes across, but they're also increasingly weirder and weirder. And you start seeing these calculations in his head, like, I know I want to fuck these girls, but is it really worth it, right? Because they're just insane, right? And it seems like I'm going to have to deal with a lot of shit that I just don't want to deal with. I want to go home, and now I can't, right? And you don't have, any real space, I don't think, in Satan's Brew, where you get a lot of this kind of, natural, like really recognizably human-like development, this kind of, upping the ante in terms of flirtation. You don't get this kind of gradual unfolding, and you don't get these like mental machinations. You start with a guy that's like completely abnormal. He goes through.
But the thing about Woody Allen, though, is he's really sort of trying to make films that are kind of like Bergman-esque or sort of like Ibsen-esque, but with kind of like Jewish or kind of like sort of like
Well,
Marxist.
what about the Scorsese example? Since that was like the bulk of it. I mean, did you see the connection? Like, do you know that film, by the way, or what?
No, I'm. Wait, what film was it again?
After Hours by Scorsese.
No, again, that's one I've neglected to watch, and I'm afraid. But
It's very different from a lot of his movies. Like, I'd really recommend it, but it's also a great film.
Good shout. I'll check it out, man. I just think that kind of like, I think Satan's Brew is a kind of cartoon, but I think it's a very, very interesting cartoon in the sense. I mean, just like in the sense, like I just think it's there is something kind of anarchic about it that I don't think it's like it's like a whimsical kind of cartoonishness, and these people are real people with like inner worlds that I'm kind of like, ooh, the character of Walter Kranz, who is he's more like he's more like a kind of a sort of a harlequin figure here. These are kind of like, this is like a commedia dell'arte again, which and the way that at the end they all jump up, ha ha ha, we're not dead, it's like, again, this is part of it, I think, that reinforces that. It's sort of frustrating and alienating in a way, but I mean, maybe I think it's just it's like I see it as part of the overall very German sense of humor too. I don't know, like I don't know what else I could say about the film. I think I mean, on the level of like formalism, in terms of like Fassbinder, Fassbinder's odd because he has a very pedestrian kind of style. I mean, mostly they're like TV level productions in terms of the budget and the equipment. So there's this almost kind of very kitchen, not kitchen sink, because that's kind of too specific, but it's very pedestrian, very kind of like no style for boilerplate.
Would you say it's better than his other films, or what?
You mean overall, or in terms of like how it's made?
Well, it didn't seem like in general you were like a fan of his films when you had that conversation with Dan Linden. So I'm just
fan of Fassbinder. No, I really like Fassbinder films.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I really, I mean, films to watch from him be Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, Fox and His Friends. I've got many others that I'm suddenly blank on. A Year of 13 Moons. These were very good films, and a lot of them he's kind of like exploring sort of ideas, sort of melodrama in a way. He's exploring kind of character relationships, and there's lots of very strong character relationships. This is a very different film kind of altogether from those sort of films. But I think, and for that reason, like I think it adds to the fact that people just can't comprehend like what the fuck it's up to. I look at it. Tell you what, when I look at that film, I look at Walter Kranz and I go, oh, it's like a weird nightmare I would have, kind of like in a novel about myself. Kind of like I read like a German novel, like I read a Thomas Mann novel, and I go to sleep one night and I wake up in the dream where I have some fat German wife and some and some brother, like something out of who's the chap who wrote that novel, Population 1230? Jim Thompson, like a retarded brother out of a Jim Thompson novel, and I have and my publishers are like banging at the door, like, where's the new novel? And then you look at the novel, and it's not one you've written; it's one by Stefan Gierger. And you go and you look in the mirror and like, oh fuck, I'm Stefan Gierger. And like, yeah, it's this fever dream, what have you. I mean, I don't like like I mean, I quite like its kind of dry sort of sense of humor. I mean, there are just some really funny fucking lines from the film too. I think it's witty as well.
There was one line I wanted to highlight. Yeah, there was one line.
I really do think every scene has something really like some really witty like lines in it, kind of where people are talking to one another.
What was it? What did he say? It was something like, leave. Wait, what was it? Oh, leave speaking to those predestined to speak. Right. I thought that was a great line.
There's also one where you were talking about where she was like, how could I ever follow you? And he says something on the lines of kind of, this is the finest form of humiliation, to expose one to oneself to an inferior. And I'm just trying to find some other lines from it. I don't, because I would feel guilty if I. Yeah, my time will come. No one understands me. I've decided to change my life. Go work in a factory. Maybe that will cure you. I'll have a suit made to measure. That's it.
Yeah, he keeps doing that Rilke line, right? I must change my life, right, again and again.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm not sure if you how you are on time, but I mean, I have some other things written down. NFTs, if they're a topic of interest to you. I also watched your video on your drawings, if you want to talk about that. Or we could call the balkanization of the arts, which we sort of alluded to but didn't really touch on. If anything,
well, let's try and quickly run through them. Let's try and quickly run through as much of it as we can. Like, give ourselves like 40 minutes or so like left to go.
Okay, all right. So first, like the balkanization, does it at all worry you, like when you see stuff like, obviously Patreon on some level is going to be useful for artists. Like I'm eventually going to start a Patreon, like whatever. On the other hand, I am very nervous about the fact that everybody seems to now have some sort of outlet for their extremely niche proclivities. You know what I mean? Like if you want to, like, how you have those like jokes, like when people come out as trans and people want to make fun of them and be like, well, I want to come out as an attack helicopter or some shit. Like they have a subreddit dedicated specifically to finding people that make these like that specific kind of anti-trans joke, like coming out as and specifically it's in the structure of coming out as an attack helicopter or some kind of animal or something like that. Similarly, like you want any kind of podcast and any kind of topic, any kind of like, aesthetic. You want it to be serious. You want it to have tons of jokes. You want this, you want that. There's going to be something out there spoon feeding that to you and telling you in exchange for $5 a month, I could give you like an infinite supply of this kind of shit. Like that kind of like really worries me, because human beings, especially in a time when they're getting more and more, perhaps leisure is not the right word, but in general, you're getting more of something. And, a century from now, you're going to get even more of things. Human beings are not very good at cutting off the spigot, right? If they're really moved by some sort of personal fixation, they're just going to go for it. And I think stuff like Patreon and just the, universality of like all these like little things you could latch onto anytime you feel like, that really kind of drives people to, in many cases, act out their worst instincts. And I include myself like in that category, right? Which is why I say stuff like I have to be very careful about what I'm allowing into my life, because I could easily just go into any kind of fucking direction. I could easily find a personal fixation or preoccupation of mine because I have so many to begin with, and I could find something to scratch that itch, and avoiding that scratching is paramount to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, well, the way I see it is, well, I mean, the name of my podcast is Against Nature, and like, I'm a big admirer of Huysmans and kind of the whole kind of synthetic culture of bohemianism and flaneurism that was sort of coming up around the time of kind of the decadent symbolist movement, the literary movement in France. The idea of cosmopolitanism and the idea that kind of, you can sort of go into your own synthetic world. I mean, the problem with Huysmans, however, was that he was a Catholic, and, he had all kinds of complicated feelings about this fear of icons, other religions, what have you. I like the idea of sort of almost in a hermit-like way, sort of like sort of being on kind of my mountaintop and kind of like looking down and sort of like being at a bit of a distance, sort of a Calvinist, keeping a Calvinist sort of distance from sort of mass culture. And I mean to the limits of kind of like what's convenient or what's sort of expedient. I think, you know, obviously there's an anxiety of not getting you know, like falling into a certain kind of thing, or, you know, I don't know, like I just think, yeah, definitely. I mean, you talk about the balkanization of the arts. I think for me, the real issue has always been institutionalization and sort of managerial culture and the managerial class, and with the whole problem of that, really, kind of everything being PR and market research, endless shit like that. I mean, like that, I'm allergic to that in a way. Mm-hmm. And I never wanted to, like, you know, I can't even, maybe, I mean, I kind of fess up to that being a kind of personal failing on my part. I don't have the facility to deal with kind of the you know, all the bullshit that comes with, you know, you know, publicity and PR and sort of networking and what have you. So I just choose not to participate, like, reflexively, you know, kind of, and what me help most people who want to be artists do. That's what they end up doing. They don't end up doing, you know, becoming professional. They just kind of, you know, do something else. But kind of but still there's the whole problem of sanctioned art, right? Authenticity, you know, we can all kind of be skeptical about authenticity, what authenticity is. It's not like any of us can throw out the baby with the bathwater in our actual practice or our lives or our making, and it's not like anyone's going to say or do anything to get rid of it as a cultural phenomenon. Authenticity is part of our lives, and the fact is that being successful or being you know, a time-serving, tenured member of an institution or a certain class, kind of, or, you know, being published here, being with these people, confirms legitimacy on you, gives you power, gives you, and that's what we want, really. At the end of the day, we would like a bit of power. The benefit, though, of not having power and being outside of it, though, is that power doesn't corrupt you. You know, there's no poison chalice. But the whole then problem then becomes, how do you aim for authenticity from the point of view where everyone looks at you like as an amateur or whatever, you know, like the whole question then becomes, you know, like, what do you aim, you know, how do you aim for? I mean, what I talk about in my practice personally, Alex, is I talk about aiming for amateurism. I mean, what does it mean for a professional to aim for amateurism? What does it mean for an amateur to aim for amateurism? Does it mean re-emerging from a certain kind of, you know, authenticity into a new kind of thing, or not? You know, it raises a whole, but then that's the problems now, and that's the problem. The institution confers power and authenticity, and it's something that kind of, like, you know, it's part of the whole, like, rat race of that kind of world. It's, you know, and it's, you know, what does one do about, not everything produced by that world is extant trash, just as the same as not everything produced outside of it is extant pure, or, you know, whatever, or unsullied or innocent of derogationist vice or what have you. I mean, this is why I think something like a historical consciousness is important, or a sort of a kind of autodidacticism then, if we, you know, like, because I mean, that's an elite idea of culture, but I don't think, like we were talking about earlier in the conversation, I don't think it is kind of necessarily, I think it can be a democratic thing. I think, you know, the idea is that kind of, it gives one the freedom to make one's own judgments, to form one's own personal taste more freely, to become involved in an autodidactic kind of journey with art, where you are kind of, you're considering it, you're learning from it, you're curious about it, you learn more, and you experience this sort of thing as a historical sort of narrative. You experience it as because it builds itself that way. I think that's what's important, and that's what's really the important thing in the face of what we see now, which is, you know, monoculture, you know, like balkanization or what have you. It is to kind of talk about, sort of like hold up a kind of an idea of a high culture, which is historical, which kind of like is a kind of canon, you know, and that is kind of what's going hand in hand with what's happening now with this dumbing down. It's a kind of a slow dissolving of kind of the canon. Like, oh, was this person really that great? Like, does it really matter kind of if they were great for their time? In our own time now, isn't Picasso a bit, like doesn't he look like a misogynistic monster? And anyway, futurism looks much more cool to me. A 21st century, teenager, that looks much more, do you know what I mean? Kind of, it's very easy to make aesthetic judgments, and it can be capricious because you can do it instantly. And I have my opinion about this painting. I don't have to ever look at it again. Kind of,
yeah. Well, since we have limited time, let's just run quickly to your drawing. So you uploaded, I think in the last.
First, before we get to the drawings, though, like you talked about NFTs.
Oh yeah.
And we have these things like CryptoPunk and what's the other thing?
Meebits is the second.
And all this stuff thing. This is a thing that is kind of going to be I think this is going to be a more and more common thing in kind of
100%.
the Kunstwelt, at least, the sort of the gallery world. I mean, there are stories now appearing in sort of the Telegraph and stuff about record auction sales of CryptoPunk JPEGs and all this sort. Non-NFTs are very interesting. I mean, I won't pretend to be an expert on them at all, but the idea of
you said none of them are interesting.
Did I say that? No, I find them interesting. Is what
you do find them interesting.
I find them interesting.
Yeah,
I won't pretend to know anything about them. I mean, I don't find it really intriguing as art. Yeah. I mean, but as a cultural phenomenon, it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, that's the way that I'm approaching it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of anything kind of permissible may no longer be avoidable in that sense. If stuff like that is going to break the prices, we're gonna see it a lot more in places like Sotheby's and what have you. I mean, in a way, it's quite kind of trendy and stylish now, or it has kind of a chic sort of thing about it. But it may very well be something. Again, I can't pretend to have any expert knowledge in this, but very much what NFTs will become or their significance, I don't think is yet clear now. Even it's like it's.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to make these kinds of predictions, but I will make the following prediction. I agree with you that NFTs and things like them will stay in the future. And if you just think about like just ordinary human proclivities, that's kind of it feels kind of inevitable in that sense because. So just to give a little bit of background, you mentioned CryptoPunks. The company that developed them, Larva Labs, I believe they were developed in 2017. And they have only started, reaching their, true, well, I don't want to say true, fundamentally, who knows what they're worth, but the market valuation of CryptoPunks, right? Some of the rarest ones, they sell something for like, sometimes like, I think hundreds of ether, right? And each ether as of now is a little bit over $2,000. And so the way that this works is, so we had the CryptoPunks in 2017, and the reason why they're given, any kind of value is it's basically like a kind of scarcity, and it's like parameters built upon scarcity. So if you mint an NFT, it's first of all, it's a one of a kind, right? There's never going to be an NFT just like it. You put it, well, right now it's mostly an Ethereum blockchain. Theoretically, they probably have like Binance Chain NFTs also at this point. I haven't really looked into that, but like it's interesting because when you look at the sort of parameter optimization, so most NFTs that are CryptoPunks, they are human beings, right? But a certain sub percentage of them are they could be like in the form of like some sort of alien, or Meebits is the new one that Larva Labs released, sometimes like in the form of like a pig or something. And that is one way that you could optimize for scarcity. Another one is, does this, JPEG character have a gold chain? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, that also adds to the scarcity. You might have, something where only like 0.02%, of CryptoPunks or Meebits have a certain parameter. And I think part of the reason why this emerged is, it might have something to do with the cultural assumptions that allowed more kind of abstract art in the kind of, Pollock sense, right? Or in the, like in that vein, right? Where people are like, okay, well, if we're sort of democratizing art in this way, and we are telling you that this Pollock is valuable because look at what's happening at this part of the canvas, and this squiggle is different from this other side. People are just looking at that and saying, well, let's just optimize things in a way that we could even understand even better. Let's just run this kind of essentially a statistical model here, and we're going to say that this has this valuation because it's one of like 5 CryptoPunks that has the following little asset, right? And it's not surprising in that sense. Like when you open up the floodgates, as it were, with something like abstract expressionism, which itself is, the value seems kind of abstract. You're going to have tons of like geeky types, right, that aren't even in the art world saying, well, if you're going to, say that this is valuable to us, we are now going to do this from our perspective, right, from a statistical model, and we're going to throw the same thing back at you, right, and it's going to accumulate its own value. And I feel like people that are in abstract art very seriously, or like abstract artists, for example, they wouldn't be able to come up with some sort of reason to rebut this other kind of like theory evaluation that's emerging, and that's based essentially on little more than math. And even beyond math, though, you have this kind of this desire among human beings to just sort of peacock, right, and just to kind of showboat, where they have like this other project, the Central Land, where eventually you're probably going to have a situation where you buy up land, in the Central Land, which is, all kind of like digital land or whatever, which goes for pretty expensive valuations now. You could turn that into a room. You could put all your NFTs in that room. You could have some sort of avatar NFT that represents you, like a CryptoPunk or a Meebit or whatever. And you could invite people in your room, right? You can like, check out my fucking NFTs. I bought this for 15 ETH. I bought this for 100 ETH, or I bought this for half an ETH and now it's worth 200 ETH, right? And because human beings have that desire, kind of like forevermore until, we're no longer recognizably human, I think this kind of thing is going to just keep growing.
Yeah, I think, there's still a lot to learn about blockchain and cryptocurrency and what have you, and NFTs and I certainly, they're going to continue to be, I think they're going to be more and more prevalent and kind of the art market anyway. I mean, I'd have no problem calling them art. I don't see any pressing need to not to sort of define them against art.
Yeah, I agree.
I think, personally, my interests are quite traditional in this respect, kind of in the Greenbergian formula sense, like in design and what have you, but also in the unique touch of the artist, so the handcrafted value of the work. Whereas I think the kind of within the schema that the kind of this art exists in, kind of this is all about kind of, this all comes from a kind of formulation of kind of art and aesthetics that really is like again opposed to Greenbergianism, opposed to kind of those ideas of handcrafted values. And
well, so, it's handcrafted perhaps in some way, right? Like for example, Marcel Duchamp had like his his little fucking contraptions that would like create art after enough time, by like an automatic process.
So ready-mades. I think ready-mades is different, though. I think.
Not the ready-mades, though.
I mean handcrafted. I just mean the actual kind of like touch of the art. I mean minimalism. It was manufactured in, like, what the sculptures were manufactured in factories, but they're sleek surfaces. There's no brush strokes. That's what I mean. Minimalists were very skeptical. Kind of like, we talk about how sublime brush strokes are, but it's just like greasy lard. I mean, like, why does it? So it's this skepticism about the value that kind of this stuff holds, kind of as art. The way that we talk about sort of the brush strokes and paintings. Minimalists said this was the way that people talked about handcrafted Italian leather. It's really no different, this is, one sees the discontinuity between a certain kind of modernist art and that kind of art as well. And, you need to take that into, and evaluations aesthetically in this sense are difficult. I mean, postmodern art is difficult in that way. If you were to ask if painting is dead, and someone says, no, I mean, and you ask, well, okay, give me a good example of a living painter who's really, really good, and if they were to say, Gerhard Richter, he's really good. well, that'd be a very weird choice to say, because a lot of Gerhard Richter's paintings are about how painting is dead, or rather are about kind of painting being displaced by the camera. You know, he does paintings of photographs of paintings and what have you. So, you know, it's a weird, do you know what I mean? It's like, he's definitely a good painter and definitely a kind of a really great artist, but it's a difficult thing to say they're good paintings when the paintings kind of, a lot of what they do sets out to kind of undermine kind of certain things or kind of argue with certain things. Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, you know, I in a way kind of am drawn much more to kind of, you know, a traditionalist kind of like art, where kind of, you know, you look at it and there's kind of like there's an interesting manipulated surface and kind of like a strong sense of design and like color and that's kind of what I think that's quite my traditional kind of like modernist is bias. But yeah, what you want to talk about my drawings?
Oh yeah, so the drawings that you uploaded, I guess just like frame this a little bit. The way that I would, you know, from my perspective, what I would describe what you're doing, and you could respond to this after. I assume that if you're going to make, you know, abstract drawings, you know, you've probably spent a long time studying abstract art. You've seen things that happen in terms of, you know, for example, how lines get drawn or painted, the relationship, you know, between space and lines, and the patterns in that regard that you've seen in the past. And now you're saying, okay, perhaps there are some, you know, spatial problems, let's call them. There's other kinds of artistic problems. And, you know, here you go, you know, you are responding to things that you've seen in the past, and you're trying to, you know, construct some kind of response to that, right? And this is why it's called, you know, abstract in that sense, right? You've sort of, you know, put this into your brain over a long enough period of time, and now these things that look like, you know, code language to everybody else, to you, you know, you sort of have a sense of what you're doing in terms of why this line belongs here, why you have X amount of space there, why this, you know, collage is sort of cut off and added to in some sense. Like, is that a fair assessment of what your thinking process is as you're doing these?
Yeah, well, there's in a certain way, there's a kind of again, coming back to that word, automatism going on, where, you know, one almost aims for this sometimes, where you get so involved in the work, you kind of just kind of get pulled along by it, and you're making choices almost intuitively. That's the sort of ideal condition. A lot of the time it isn't that. A lot of the time it is kind of quite calculating, kind of like, ooh, does this work? Does this not work? You know, trying this and going, what if I did this? But generally there is the sense that, you know, if I do something, or if I make, or if I put a mark in an area, or you know, remove something from an area, that it's, you know, for a purpose, because I feel like something isn't right, or I feel that something needs to go there, or something needs to, you know, not be there, or something has to, you know, it takes that sort of thing, where kind of everything follows on one from another, kind of where things are adjusted one to another too, and that's the benefit of working sort of with the drawings, but also kind of in an abstract way, I suppose. And abstract does feel, it's you know, it's a pejorative word, but it's you know, I think it is important in a way. I do like the integrity of a word like abstract, because I like the idea of kind of abstraction, I suppose. I like the idea that of abstraction, but you know, the painters I talk to, the abstract painters I talk to, and the abstract artists I talk to, we talk about this a lot. We kind of talk about kind of abstraction. When you think about it, kind of most abstract art, and a lot of kind of kitschy abstract art nowadays, is kind of geometric art. You know what I mean? It's kind of like grids and lots of boxy geometric stuff. And in what way are grids really abstract? You know, in what way are squares really abstract? You know, it's like a lot of the time, kind of my kind of boredom with some abstract art is like, it doesn't get kind of it doesn't get its hands dirty. It tries to be too iconic, or it tries to be too tasteful, too not ornamental in a way, because ornament would imply a certain kind of involvement. There's a kind of coffee shop abstract art that you see a lot, like kitsch abstract. You know what I mean? Like, where you go in like Starbucks and there's like tasteful, sort of slight monochrome, like sort of splats. I mean, sort of maybe resembling the work of the materialist or the Cobra art movement or something like that. But for me, kind of like abstract art is simply ones that are looking for new compositions and looking like for new ways to organize things in painting, new ways to actually make paintings, to actually make them, not to have them come up with new ideas, not to rack your brains with high thoughts about what you want to say or what you want to convey, but just to make the thing differently. That's where the poesis comes in for the painting, because like an abstract painting, where do you start the painting, and then when do you continue, kind of this is the thing. And I like the idea of like the drawings don't necessarily have a beginning or an end. They're drawings that are torn up and put together. Hans Arp used to do this kind of during the sort of the post-war Dadaist movement in France, sort of tearing drawings up and putting them back together. But then sort of playing with the edge of it too. I mean, like, I've sometimes I talk with Mark about the pictures. He comes into my house and I put them on the wall and we discuss them and what have you. And like we're always talking about the relation to the wall, and the fact that in my experience, so often drawings are like the unfortunate sort of stepbrother of paintings, in a way. Like, my background really is as an illustrator. Kind of that's I'm a much more of a draftsman than I am a painter. And still with painting, there's a fumbling quality, and I try too often to impose the kind of what I know as a draftsman onto painting, and it can take you far. But but with drawing, very often kind of there's a sense that it's preparatory. It's something that leads you up to a painting or whatever. And when you see drawings on the wall next to paintings in galleries, they just look so small and meager and defenseless. And paintings, they almost like fall away next to all the other work. And even when you put a drawing in your house, it's always like, you always have to like get in so close to appreciate the details. You have to suddenly stop and kind of like from a distance, it kind of becomes just another kind of porthole on your wall. I was just the drawings in that video came about as kind of an ongoing thing to kind of see how painterly I can make drawing, like because it's true to say, in a way, like Cézanne said, that when one paints, one draws. But that doesn't necessarily apply the other way around. You would be a fool to say when one draws, one paints. So, but to what way can you have a painterly drawing, or how can you have a drawing that has some of the qualities one would find in a painting, or how would a drawing be strong enough, or kind of be muscular enough to kind of have the force on a wall that a painting might have? I mean, these are just kind of they're fantasies, really, in a way, but these they're irresistible to me, and they kind of spur me to make these works, which sometimes, I've finished them and I'm not even sure kind of whether I've made something good or made something shit. I mean, that's the thing. And certainly sometimes that's the thing with abstract art. It's the thing with Pollock,
Yeah.
like you look at Pollock.
And those are actually going to be some of my questions, like for example, like so like in this like system, right? And you said you're sort of kind of like experimenting here. Is it possible to describe what you're trying to say, or is I'm trying to say XYZ? Is that like not coherent in the system? How would you go about, like, if someone were to pose that question?
No, yeah, I think it's the latter, Alex. I think that's the thing. I don't really want to say anything with the drawings. There are, even with the drawings that I've done, kind of like my figurative art in the past, I don't ever really think I was there was ever a point where I kind of like, I want to make the audience think this. I mean, maybe that's just my own kind of thing, perhaps. Very often the art that I start out with a kind of very clear idea of kind of, here's what I want to do, and here's kind of like, very often I kind of, that ends in terrible failure. When one tries to kind of, especially the thing about visual art and painting is that you can't really pre-calculate everything. You know, you learn through the experience of the making, and the work and the making informs you more than any kind of a priori kind of like reason kind of like a you can form the best thing you can do is form stratagems. And really the strategy for kind of this work is just kind of to think about it mainly in those terms of kind of pictorialism, I guess, design, kind of like, I have this shape, now I'm going to do something in this shape. Okay, now I've put something there, now what do I want to put next to it? Okay, suddenly this thing's happening. What's happening? I'm not sure. What do I need to do? Do I need to look at it later, or do I do that? You know, and as you go along, you grow your own vocabulary, or what have you. You make continue but the idea is the work becomes the engine itself, I think. I mean, and that's something that is very particular, I think, to the making of sort of abstractionist kind of art or what have you. I mean, certainly I couldn't think of a literary equivalent.
I was gonna ask that. Like, is it legitimate to search for equivalents? Because okay, so if on the one hand, you know, you are, you know, obviating this question of like having something to say, and then also you're saying
poetry is probably the closest.
Wait, what would you say?
I mean, poetry is probably closer than literature. I mean, I don't know. I mean, all time, it's tricky to sort of, it's not quite clear in my head, like as a sort of fully coherent concept. But I think, you know, certainly someone like Mallarmé was a writer who, like people like Cézanne and the Cubists were looking at as a kind of, an example of a kind of, you know, the literary equivalent of what they were doing. And like Trotsky kind of saw this too. Like he was very, I mean, his whole idea of art for art's sake is kind of a result of him reading Mallarmé, because he can't quite square Mallarmé within his idea of a politically, great art's political inclinations. I think though the idea of poetry though, like whenever I've made poetry, when I speak to poets, there seems to be this element where, actually there's a wonderful quote from Maurice Blanchot that I read in his book, The Space of Literature, where he talks about what could be called, what could be something quite close to this actually. Oh yes, this is a quote from The Space of Literature. This is Maurice Blanchot. We rediscover poetry as a powerful universe of words, where relations, configurations, forces are affirmed through sound, figure, rhythmic mobility in a unified and sovereignly autonomous space. Thus, the poet produces a work of pure language, and language in this work is returned to its essence. He creates an object made of language, just as the painter, rather than using colors to reproduce what is, seeks the point at which his colors produce being. Or again, the poet strives, as Rilke did during his Expressionist period, or as perhaps Ponge does, to create the poem thing, which would be, so to speak, the language of mute being. He wants to make of the poem something which all by itself will be form, existence, and being. That is the work. And he's a fantastic literary critic, Blanchot.
So just I guess that's a segue into this. So if in this system, it's not legitimate to say that you have that you're trying to say something in these drawings, maybe in some other ones, it'll be different. But specifically what you put up on the channel. So just kind of like leading from there into. The reason why I wanted to draw the kind of like poetry example, right, which you brought up, is so you also mentioned that along the way, right, as you're doing the drawings, you don't necessarily have a sense, or perhaps not an easy sense, of what's right, what's wrong, does this line belong here, right? But as you're going through the drawings, right, you sometimes make comments like, oh, I really like this one. I like what I did here, or this part is interesting, right? So there's something going on there, at least in this kind of like purely technical space. The reason why I asked about poetry is, okay, so well, a couple of things. So Greenberg in his essay, like, he's sort of like off the cuff makes this kind of like stray remark about imagining like a poetry like purely of sound, and of course such things have been attempted before. To me, that is a pretty illegitimate, partly for his own kind of concept of medium specificity, right? If you have language available to you to denigrate words which have meaning to nothing but pure sound and how they sound in the brain or whatever, that is leaving way too much on the table, right, in terms of like the creation of poetry. It's like, why even write poetry? So, but let's take that to another extreme, right? Forget, you could sort of isolate things by sound. Let's say you want to do something parallel to these kinds of abstract drawings. If I construct a poem where it's just like a bunch of perhaps random images, some of them sound very pleasing to the ear perhaps, and some of them perhaps I work very hard at to sort of like make it sonorous in some way, musical in some way. And then ultimately perhaps I rip out some of the words, right, rearrange the letters, turn that into a collage with like some other printout that I'm doing, and mash them together. Like, would you consider that well, maybe not legitimate poetic expression, because who's to say what's legitimate in that kind of universe, but would you say that that is an advisable form of poetic expression?
I think it depends on what the situations are for the success of the art, really. I mean, in a way, kind of all these things, all that kind of like you could like say that art's striving for, are kind of fundamentally absurd. Like there is no such thing as an independent art or kind of an independent technology, really. But at the same time, this idea of kind of it's a kind of an ideal. It's an idea of like art. You're opening up a parallel world with the art. You're Greenbergian kind of. As like again, Greenberg kind of gives you all sorts of opportunities to misread him, and he like makes all sorts of errors later in his life. I mean, I don't consider myself a Greenbergian formalist. I mean, like he's like he's an interesting figure, and he's like a sort of a nexus point for all these different sort of culturally significant moments and themes in sort of modernism. I think I'm not interested in Greenbergian flatness. I'm not interested in necessarily in I'm not sure how color is part of the practice of the drawings anyway. So the art, if you're going to define, if you're trying to define your art, you've got to try and define it on your own terms as well. And that's the sort of thing I'm trying to do as well. Myself, drawings are quite easy to produce, and they're quite easy to store, and they're not that expensive to make compared to paintings. I don't really have a proper kind of studio space to sort of turn out sort of massive paintings or all the funds to make those sort of things either. So it's this other thing where trying to sort of make sense of where sort of my practice would fit into Greenbergian form that would be tricky, because that's kind of a different world to me. But here in my world, kind of like making these drawings up here, I still feel that kind of what I'm doing connects in some way to kind of these artists I'm interested in and what they're doing. And I feel that in a weird way, kind of like I'm being like, one is drawn inexorably to a certain kind of point, kind of like there's all this sort of stuff in the past I'm interested in, but it's more like one's being drawn to the future. You know, it's one thing after another. You know, continuity. The work is its own thing that sort of keeps it going. You know, I used to kind of like you know, I used to see art as a much more kind of way to sort of vent my emotions and what have you. But yeah, like but I don't know, like I quite, I don't know. I don't know if it's like about emotional experience or about subjectivity. Like I think it's just about kind of like the process being the content, and the work kind of leading to its own discoveries. And you know, because all the time I've tried to take sort of certain projects in directions that I thought, you know, they make sense, or I'm upping the ante. No, the best stuff I see, because I've filed and stored it away, and I sort of like the best stuff is always the stuff that really kind of like comes all by itself, by surprise. It almost kind of emerges from the work itself, where kind of like you look at something you made a while ago and you go, oh, that's got something to it. Or you look at something and it's shit, and you go, kind of, fuck this, you know, you throw it away. You know, Cezanne used to do this actually.
How do you have these kinds of boundaries though? Like, again, like if you're going through some of these drawings, and like, what would be the boundaries there?
It's changing all the time, you know, like it's a tricky thing. I think, you know, because it's a thing with intentionality, isn't it? You know, you don't, there's a trick in it. You have to be skeptical of both. I feel taught myself to be skeptical of criticism and praise. You know, I think it's tricky.
I agree.
You have to be careful not to congratulate yourself, and you have to be careful not to be too harsh on yourself. It's very easy to love the things one makes. It's very easy to compare stuff to everything else and go kind of, well, that's not right. But what if you make something that's different from everything else? Mm-hmm. You know, what if you genuinely make something that kind of like, you know, no one has made before, and, you know, it looks a bit trash even to you? You know, kind of what you're going to do then? You know, I'm not saying, you know, you've rediscovered the wheel or what, but you've made something that really is your own. And kind of, you know, the what's possible isn't quite, you know, what do? You know, what's quite the way to proceed? It's tricky, and it involves sometimes a lot of, the problem is not to be consistent, Alex. I think this is an important thing about aesthetics. Don't try and be consistent in your aesthetic philosophy. Just try and be dispensable. You know, otherwise you're just going to fall into aesthetic cynicism. Again, it's not about racking your brain with, why am I doing this?
I think in general, aesthetic philosophies are ill-advised, right? I'm very, you know, that's not a good idea.
Fair enough. I think, you know, I think, you know, my problem is I've got too much fucking aestheticism running through my fucking veins. But I think it really is kind of like, it's not about kind of, oh, what am I going to do? Like, who's going to look at this? You know, like, who even, like, what, you know, like, you know, like, maybe getting back to what we were saying earlier, I quite like the kind of purposelessness of that kind of thing, or the purposive purposelessness, that kind of like, I don't worry about all the shit kind of like I just know my responsibility. And this is what I take from Dan, you know, and what Dan says. And like, you're like, your responsibility is to make the fucking thing, you know. Mm-hmm. You know, you're like, you know, what, you know, and if you're doing that, you're doing something right. You know, like, and I think, you know, we were talking about success as well. I think at a certain level, I forget who said this, it might have been Brian Eno, but failure repeated enough becomes success. You know, like, there are failures, but like, what happens when you can like turn the failure into a fucking technique, or when the failure, oh, the accident becomes shit. You know, this is the thing about improvisation and what have you. Like, recognizing failure and recognizing success are all the time, things are adjusting and things are changing, if you're working kind of properly. And this is what writers will feel, I'm sure, and poets when they're composing as well. They're sort of writing, if you sit down and you just write 1,000 words a day, or, you know, fucking 500 words a day for a couple of months, at the end of that, you've got a novella and you've got something. And then you just go back and like a coal miner at the face of meaning, you just fucking edit something out of it. You know, like, you know, this is the work produces the work.
Yeah, that's some of the approach that I'm taking with this current novel. I mean, you know, sometimes I'm like working, like doing various things around the house, and you know, a scene comes to me, and it's like, fuck it, like, even if I'm not there in the book, you know, I'm very compelled to do the scene right now. You know, I'm gonna do the scene, right? I'm not gonna wait. Anyway, like this was a very good. Perhaps it's a good place to close out. It's going to be, I think,
Probably,
4 hour. Like it's going to be about 4 hours, I think, out even after a few edits. But we should
Well,
actually we should do this again soon. I mean, this was a very nice freewheeling conversation, and also much less preparation than the conversations I usually do. I'm very perfectionistic in that way, and it takes me a long time. But this took me, by contrast, a lot less time to
I
prep
think we did
for.
okay. I think we got through it in one piece.
Yeah.
But it's like there's all sorts of things that like I want to do videos with you about. Like I recently I've rewatched a ton of Woody Allen films with my partner Nick, and kind of like so they're fresh in my mind. And I've read all the stuff that you've written about Woody Allen, and kind of I think
From the book or from the website?
well, from your website actually, and kind of like also this other thing where you got into exchange with some prick on a website, like
Jonathan Rosenbaum.
if you say you didn't know what you're talking about with like Woody Allen, it was just like she's just like the funniest fucking thing I've ever fucking read. Like, yeah, like so yeah, like if there's someone to talk to about Woody Allen, I definitely want to have a conversation with you about.
Yeah, we could do that. In fact, like I mean, we already brought this up this time around. Maybe for the next conversation, my responsibility is I'm gonna watch Ali Eats the Soul. You watch After Hours, right? The Scorsese film.
Yeah, I'll watch After Hours. Yeah, watch Ali Eats the Fear It's the Soul. That's a good film. Very good film.
All right. And also, I mean, like, you know, whatever comes up in the interim, like maybe if I don't know, maybe if you come across something with NFTs that you find interesting, we could bring that up, like whatever, you know. I think it's nice to have like a little contrast to some of my highly kind of mechanized prepared, because that's really how my brain works much of the time. And having, you know, something that's like in the other direction is pretty good.
Yeah, it's all the videos I ever do, like with people are like just on the pure manic energy in a way. It's terrible.
That's a good thing. It's something I have to actually cultivate, right? It doesn't come to me naturally, but you know, whatever. Anyway, this was very nice. We're gonna stop.
Yeah, this was great. We'll do it again sometime. Yeah. Like I'm sorry if the last 15 minutes I've had to turn my tumble dryer on, so that's been.
Isn't it like 4 a.m. over there right now?
Yeah, it's 3 a.m. in fact. Yeah, but it's like I had to turn on a tumble dryer because I've got a dry.
I wouldn't hold anything against you. In fact, I'm shocked that you agreed to like talk at 11. I mean, I literally go to sleep at 11.
I'm rather nocturnal at that respect at the moment. But yeah, thanks for talking, man. Like I'll talk to you soon. Yeah.
Oh my God.